You mentioned eroticism or the erotic as the life drive. I think that's also where you get beauty from, in the sense that complexity itself does not lend itself to beauty. Evolution can lend itself to more complexity, but that does not inherently create something beautiful. And in the sense of art, mankind can create art, but like a tiger is beautiful, lotus flower is beautiful. Naturally, these things are, and it's not because they're more complex, it's because there's a drive toward increasing beauty. It's just base biological.
Sex, violence, pleasure, and pain, I would encompass within the erotic, right? So what is the impulse of life? What is behind will to power, the will, etc.? It's the erotic. Once you reach the threshold of utility within a specific organism or thing's objectives, it needs to create more objectives. So what does it do to create more objectives? It experiences more and more sensations. Violence in its most basic form. It's appropriation of another being, energy, at the expense of that being. So you can never really get past violence unless you're dead. Salvete legionaries. I am joined today by a very, very special guest. As you can see, I have Alaric the Barbarian here, and today we're going to be talking about a certain book written, we presume by Alaric, but all the praises are from ChatGPT, so we don't know. Maybe Alaric's actually just an AI, but I have this book here, Schizoposting, and we're going to talk about it today. But without further ado, Alaric, welcome to the podcast, and if you could just briefly introduce yourself to the Legionaries.
Well, thank you for having me on. Alaric the Barbarian, Alaric the Barbarian. Honestly, every podcast I've been on, they've asked me how I pronounce it, and I have no idea. Been writing under this name for years. Still don't know. Anyway, I guess I started off as a writer on history and martial arts. I still do those things, but with this book, at least, I got more into, I don't even know, do you call it theory? It is kind of schizophrenic, but
more theory than like the regular right-wing people.
Yeah, it's a book on culture ultimately, and kind of my read of what the past 10 years have been, where we're headed, and the actual state of thought, rather than like, I don't know, like you said, a lot of people aren't that well versed in theory, and they try to do this bit where they just rail against imagined enemies of traditionalism or something along those lines. And even Girard, even the classical traditionalist thinkers don't support that. But anyway, that's a digression. We'll get into that later. Yes, I did actually write the book. I've microdosed LLM psychosis since then. That's fun. But this was my essay collection that I put together over about 6 months. I didn't intend for it to be a book, and then it just kind of coalesced together. I realized that I could draw a through line between these very disparate topics. Like the first essay is on history, and then I talk about sex and gender, violence, and then it goes more into like the method of technological, I don't want to say slavery and ape Ted K here, but how the technology we use every day actually messes with us. And I think very few, especially on the right, even come close to understanding that. And I'm hopefully trying to make a contribution toward a better look at like what technology is in our lives right now.
Yeah, totally. And I think we'll definitely talk about that. And I want to talk about also, capital as artificial intelligence and as technology and sort of tying those things together.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to talk about first was I really wanted to get a sort of summation of your critique of this like historical man. And you said a lot of people didn't get through the first essay you wrote. So maybe for those people that were too normie for the schizoposting style, we can just give them a brief summation of the sort of argument you're putting forward there, and then we can discuss that a bit.
Well, I said that I started off writing just about history, and I've done a lot of essays on the conquistadors or Rome or something along those lines. And you can rail against the liberal notion of history of like, everything was backwards until we invented gay sex and the Civil Rights Act. But that's only one part of it. The thing that actually like bothers me, and I think a lot of people with how we think about history now, is that it's intended to make you do and be nothing. It's history as in, I don't know, not identity, but rather prescription to avoid repeating history. Everybody hears that, we study history to avoid repeating the mistakes of our ancestors. And I think that's just in itself, as a very small shade of how we think about it, that's lame. It just tells you to do less things. Naturally, history then becomes a narrowing over time. That's one issue I have with it. The other issue is that it sets up man as an inherently progressive creature, and the only thing you can do is contribute to progress in this very, very specific Whiggish sense. It doesn't let you, you know, it doesn't let you have vision in the same way that the people you're studying had vision. And those are kind of my key issues with it. But yeah, I do throw a lot of random thinkers out in the first essay. It was kind of a filter, and it was very funny to get replies from people not even making it through the first essay and having no idea what I'm talking about. But you write a book called Schizoposting, I guess it kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah, you can never kowtow to the masses and sort of dilute what you're writing to fit their petty mass piggish desires. So I'm totally with that. But sort of briefly on this topic, when you get this Hegelian notion of history, right, that through processes of negation you're reaching that absolute ideal, it sort of posits that progress for progress sake is good, first of all. And then it also, I think, removes the agency of like the subject to actually shape history in a unique way that doesn't have a clear teleology the way that realizing the Hegelian absolute does. So I guess my question with that specifically is, in regards to history, do you think that, I don't know if I'd necessarily call it the less view of history, but this view of history that I think we're both critiquing, it's to me seems like a subsumption of the subject, right, the individual and his agency through this idea that substance moves on its own towards a progressive, absolutely good end long term. And because of this sort of descriptive of history, ultimately we're stripped of any malleability or opportunity to transform or shape history as prescriptive in a way that isn't sort of like, let's say, predefined by just like progress of history for the sake of progress. Is that sort of making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. It takes away the single person's influence on anything. If we continue talking about history in the same way in 800 years, they'll talk about Trump as the natural culmination of ideas rather than a complete revolution in American political thought, which honestly he has been with current events alone. Uh, it just takes away the notion that you personally can do anything, that you're only enthralled in material forces beyond yourself. It's just, lame is the best word I have for it. It's sad. The other thing is that history historically, terrible phrasing, but history historically has been a form of giving you an identity as of a particular people, of a particular tradition, of a particular right, like divine right or something along those lines. Now it's done not just in another way, but explicitly to remove any kind of identity or notion that you might have about yourself. I use the example of Turkmenistan as like the only country in the modern world that has the opposite of this, where their Saporyat Niazimov, I believe I'm saying it correctly. I don't speak Turkmen. But that's the thing. Neither did the Turkmen until like the 90s. They didn't exist until the 90s. And this guy just invented an entire national history to create like a cohesive people and cultural identity. And that's a lot closer to how history has been for all of mankind's past than what it is today, which is just a process of beating into you that you are nothing except a cog in a machine. Um, yeah, and by the way, we don't know anything factually more than people did before, not on a serious level. Like we don't know so much more information about the prehistoric world that it justifies this. We're still guessing in the dark, but we're guessing toward a different philosophical end, and that's the issue that I have with it.
And to add to that, it's really this sort of turning history into this sort of concretized science, or even what I would say utilitization of history. Because if you can set history, well, this is what happened in history, this is what didn't happen, this is how you need to interpret history. I hate media literacy. The term media literacy to me is just completely bullshit. And you could apply this to historical literacy, right? The way that history is taught today is this is how you're supposed to interpret it. This is the sort of message you're supposed to derive from it. And it really is like history becoming this utilitarian way, as you say, of like, let's not repeat the mistakes of the past. And there was a passage in your book where you essentially, you kind of just said it as well right now, but a lot of history is just fake. A lot of history, do we really know it happened this way or not? And then you start to say, well, is the what happened important, or in a sense, are the consequences of believing what happened more important? I think in regards to, you brought up Turkmenistan in your book, and you talk about this big project of what I would sort of tie back to George Bataille and the Glorious Operation. Like, he builds this great capital, and there's not a whole lot of people that visit the Turkmen capital, but it's this beautiful architecture, and you have a lot of these. I believe, I looked up some pictures. I think it was kind of like marbly looking, almost palace looking buildings,
Only
right?
white cars are legal. It's awesome.
Right. And you brought the word hyperstition in your book, and I totally agree. You end up rewriting your past, rewriting your history as a means to bring about a specific future, which I think, again, it ties back to this idea of agency, and really why myth is so important. Because, of course, right, with the Iliad, we don't know exactly how the Trojan War happened, but there's this term, I always bring it up in podcasts, and of course you've definitely seen it all over Frog Twitter: Achilles is real, you are not. Ultimately, history as consequence, in terms of how does it impact our ethic and ethos going forward, that's really what's important about history, rather than there's this massacre in 1568 and this is why you should pay reparations to some Bantu tribe, right, in Botswana or whatever. I'm making that up, obviously, but is there something there to be said about, and this is interesting because it's not really a trad position either. It's a sort of synthesis of recognizing the importance of like vitality in the past, but then rewriting history. Like the Turkmens, they had to create their own history. Do you think there's almost like a fusion of almost a postmodern element where you don't really have a clear past to pull from, but you end up wanting to have a better prescriptive, a more beautiful prescriptive? So you rewrite what happened so that you can actualize this sort of beautiful aesthetic vision, if that makes sense.
Well, the thing is, we do that anyway to our current vision. Like most of the things in current historical discourse that we just accept are based on like the principle of, come on, man, really? People will automatically disbelieve entire sources. You'll have very detailed sources or archaeological finds that lay out exactly what happened and exactly, one person's experience or something. And historians will look at it and by the principle of, come on, man, are you sure? They'll just ignore it. One of those was Gaspar de Carvajal, who was with the Orellana expedition down the Amazon, first Europeans to do the whole length of the Amazon River. And he said that there was flourishing civilization along the entire river, and that there were all of these varied peoples and trading relationships, architecture, multiple languages, all of these things. And he was disregarded for, the expedition was in the 16th century, and then he was disregarded all the way until very, very recently, because people looked at the Amazon and went, oh, come on, man, really? There was nothing here, and now we've done LIDAR studies, we've done soil chemistry studies and things like that demonstrated, before all of them died of disease, there actually was a flourishing civilization here. We probably should have believed the primary source. The other one would obviously be, Troy. Without Heinrich Schliemann, we would all still think Troy never existed and the whole thing was an allegory. But we know that the city actually was real. We have a site for it. There have been archaeological digs on it. As much as people criticize him for blowing up some of it, which he did, who cares? Either way, it would be a McDonald's parking lot right now if he never looked for it. So no matter what, you're going to have to omit data and enter data in. This is something Charles Fort talks about with science. It's just a question of like, what's your orientation toward that data? No matter what, you're omitting stuff, and no matter what, you're revising stuff. So you might as well have a good philosophical orientation toward it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think where I sort of want to turn this part of the conversation is, well, we're looking at these different views of history, the sort of historically determined man. Of course, again, this does go back to Hegel, because, of course, this sort of Marxist dialectic materialism, right? It's some interpretation of this Hegelian progress of history, of course, reduced to a sort of materialist outlook. But looking at that view of history, one thing I wanted to bring up in discussion is, well, what is the substance of history today? What is essentially moving history today? And what is the subject in contention with in terms of losing their agency? And you brought up, for example, simulacra and simulation a lot in the second part of your book. And I don't want to completely gloss over the beginning part, so we'll go back to that. But just sort of introducing this idea, essentially, that Baudrillard is coming up with simulation as this process of identity losing any sort of reference to the real, so to speak. So, of course, we get simulacra and modernity. And for the listener, I guess I should probably introduce these ideas in more layman terms. But our identity, for instance, it's based on a relationship to some referential before us. We're basing our identity on something before us. So in for example, I'm trying to think of a good example of this. I am, well, even like a gender or sex, I think is important. Well, if you go
Well, like
back,
Frankish
yeah,
kings all derive their right to rule from being descended from mostly Hector, if I remember correctly. The Romans themselves saw themselves as descended from Trojans. People have always drawn even mythic lineages, and that's just one explicit way to do it. But we don't do that now. We actually want to distance ourselves from those horrible British people, you know?
right. That's a better example than I was going to come up with. I cat
Oh,
caught my
you're good.
tongue a little bit, but I guess what I'm trying to say here is that essentially identity in modernity has become an instantiation of a copy of a copy of a copy. There's no real referential to some sort of, even in the role of myth, right? The myth operates as some sort of referential, which represents something more transcendent and even real. But today, once you get to, for example, one of the things I like to sort of derive is that if we take deconstruction to its sort of logical finality and we deconstruct the human animal to something uh, devoid of any referential identity, he essentially becomes this sexless androgynous being, right? You don't even have the identity of sex to assert your identity in the world. You have nothing from which you can be in the world, because the way I see it, and I think we could probably tie this into some of the things you wrote about sex and gender in this book, is that without sexuality, and this is a very good point you made. I really liked it because I was watching. Have you watched Ex Machina?
Oh, forever ago, yeah.
There was something you said in the book that was almost exactly like that, where this, the guy who's, let's say, developing artificial intelligence like robots, he's saying without sexuality, what is the point of the gray box to communicate with other gray boxes? Like the fundamental sort of impulse, right, is sexuality. And, you bring up Freud and sort of Freud's theory on this, but sexuality, I think, is fundamental to the subject needing to assert itself. What point is the subject to have a will if there's not something to reach? And sexuality becomes that sort of necessity to, let's say, clash against other beings and conflict with other identities. And we see that the end state of deconstruction is, as you point out, the sexless, androgynous sort of being, where sexuality has sort of been, commodified and commercialized to base impulse. And I guess what I wanted to ask, that was a little bit long-winded, roundabout way of coming to this. I asked this question last week too to one of my other guests, but why is sex important in identity, and why is sexuality sort of essential to be in the world?
Well, this was that's a good question, even if long. That is a good question. um, Sex and violence are like 0 and 1 in terms of our basic experiences, right? Those are the sex, pleasure, violence, pain. Those are our two basic things. I structured the book around that idea, and without both of those, you're just kind of, you're a 0 or a 1 in a progressing game of, like, Conway's Game of Life, the zero-player game. It's a theoretical, like, zero-player game where you set up a grid of dots and they interact on like predetermined rules, and they can form these giant structures in it, but there's no consciousness, or there's no actual, like, just desire or drive or unpredictability. The entire game is predicted from step zero. And that's how people tend to view human life now, at least. This whole thing, though, is kind of complicated by the fact that leftists run a lot of our historical discourse, and they believe what's convenient for them to believe in the moment. For example, they don't care about individual rights when it comes to nationalizing infrastructure or raising taxes on white people or something like that. But now that, we're having law enforcement actions, all of a sudden they're the defenders of individual liberty and the Second Amendment, things like that. With sex, if you want to criticize, perhaps homosexual behavior is a little degenerate or, not healthy, then it's an immutable facet of life. If you want to talk about heterosexuality, then all of a sudden it's like, get yourself under control. So it's complicated by the fact that these people are brazen ideologues and have nothing to say from like a basic sense of things. But yeah, I think you can consistently get a feel for what's actually right by just looking at whatever the opposite of whatever they believe is on a given topic. And with sex right now, they're generally prudes for one. They're performative prudes, really. These are people who deny the human animal's desire for sex and deny the human animal's desire for violence. And that can tell you pretty conclusively, without even any philosophy, that those are probably pretty central things if the worst people on the planet like to pretend that they're not. I know it's a non-answer, but still, I would say that, generally the right nowadays is, oh, the pro-sex faction as a result, which is a really weird thing to see. And you said that
That's
it's not a traditionalist position. It's not, but circumstances.
just to briefly add to that. I mean, this is why if you look at, for example, like the Groyper movement, in a lot of ways, their sort of, let's say, I don't know, spiritual identities is very leftist in a lot of ways. And the sort of, I think incel culture is not right wing. If of course, maybe I'm shifting the parameters of what defines the right, but what all the things you mentioned, sex, violence, pleasure, and pain, I would encompass within the erotic, right? So what is the
Yeah,
impulse of life? What is behind will to power, the will, etc.? It's the erotic. And the way I've sort of been describing it, and I know you've read some of my essays. I don't know if you read the one where I talk about this at length, but I'm going to write more at length about this in the future. But the erotic, essentially, to me, it almost becomes a tautology for evolution over time, because I think when you get like the base input of, let's say, an atom, right? It has a very basic input output. Input, the atom's there, output, like it's going to move entropically, it's going to move into open space, et cetera, blah, blah. And then, of course, through all these random sort of clashes, inputs and outputs grow progressively more complex. And the way that I view the erotic is that at a certain point, once you reach the threshold of utility within a specific organism or things, objectives, it needs to create more objectives. So what does it do to create more objectives? It experiences more and more sensations. And fundamental to this expansion of sensation is inequality. Because of course, not all beings are equal. And the role of violence, I think people don't talk about this enough, and you did talk about this a lot in your book, but I mean, to me, essentially, violence in its most basic form, I've definitely written about this a lot, is its appropriation of another being. It could be a lowercase being or uppercase being's energy at the expense of that being, right? So even a vegan is committing violence against a plant. You're appropriating the energy of this plant and you're consuming it to supplement your own energy so you continue to be in the world in an unequal relationship with that thing that you're appropriating. So you can never really get past violence unless you're dead. Then maybe that's the only
yeah.
cessation of violence. And sort of what I wanted to ask you in relation to this question, the role of violence and sexuality, all these different things, is when you get to the troon, essentially, right? And you mentioned, you talked a little bit about this in the book. When you get to the troon, it is really the anti-erotic being, because what if we're trying to control masculinity, actually let me rephrase my question and go back a little bit, because I think I want to go back a little bit in what you're writing there. Why do you think the war on men happened? Like, what was the reason? What was the end goal of all these people that were sort of putting it into effect? Because I think that's related to this question.
All right. Well, I'll start earlier. You talked about incelism and Groyperism and things like that as like not fundamentally right wing. I think it depends very much on the person, because something like 40% of men under 25 have like never had a sexual or romantic partner. So you're naturally going to have a lot under that. Some of it is right wing coded in a way, some of it's not. But ultimately, what you see with things like Groypers and things like the martyr made kind of reasonable right faction, slip of the tongue there, but they refuse to update their morals from leftist morals and are trying to contextualize right wing ends in left wing morals, which you're never going to do, which is why they all inevitably go insane trying to do it. Um, you have like, oh, we have to support the Ayatollah against Western imperialism for Hitler, bro, and it's just an insane set of beliefs to have. It's because there's no desire to reckon with the actual hard stuff, which is moral, and ultimately that's the basis of anti-male sentiment. That's what I think I outline probably the best in the book in terms of clear connections. Is it's a moralistic, anti-erotic, anti-male specifically ideology, and it will believe anything in service of those things. But that's the core aligning axis. I'll get more into the parapolitics and like the because I do think a lot of this comes from the State Department and things like that. But just in pure theory world, you mentioned eroticism or the erotic as the life drive. That's true, absolutely. I think that's also where you get beauty from, in the sense that complexity itself does not lend itself to beauty. Evolution can lend itself to more complexity, but that does not inherently create something beautiful. And in the sense of art, mankind can create art, but like a tiger is beautiful, a lotus flower is beautiful. Naturally, these things are, and it's not because they're more complex. It's because there's a drive toward increasing beauty that's just base biological. That drive is part of what people, I would say, I don't even want to say leftists, but what a lot of ideologues oppose. They just naturally find it gross, and it is kind of natural slave behavior, but we've let it run amok. um, However, with the war on men, I wanted to cover those before getting to the actual question. The war on men, I think, starts earlier with feminism, but really just blows up in 2014 specifically. In 2014, we're looking at Obama's second term and a budding Hillary Clinton presidency as far as everyone in power is concerned. At the same time, you have a lot of Middle Eastern countries causing trouble. Feminism is an international sore spot for them and can justify more NGO, UN, globalocracy creep into those countries. Those institutions, by the way, are how we do regime change, how we exert soft power over other countries, things like that. So feminism was the core aligning thing. And I don't think people remember this as much as they should. But like everybody thinks about Gamergate as the moment of like feminism versus anti-feminism becoming our dominant frame. It was before that. It was actually throughout 2014, all of these massive UN, Obama administration efforts to set that up as like the defining thing. All of a sudden, we live in a world of constant sexual violence against women, and men are perpetrating this. They drew from the Duke Lacrosse rape scandal. That was 2009, but that was brought back up. The mattress girl, Emma Sokolowski or something, dragging around a mattress after she managed to convince 0 of 3 authorities that she was raped. You had the Obama administration put together an office for the prevention of sexual assault against students. And you have all of these media stunts being funded directly or indirectly by the US government as an extension of this original seeded State Department psychological operation. It's blowback the same way that every other one of our psychological operations internationally has had blowback. We give the Taliban Stinger missiles to shoot down Russian helicopters, and then they're shooting them at us 10 years later. It's all ultimately, a psychological operation gone wrong, but that's become our dominant culture since then. And Gamergate kind of crystallized the pro con, sides of it, and we've been living in the shadow of it ever since. That's a lot of information to go through at once. I know this is I think 9,000 word essay. I'm hitting off in like 4 sentences, but yeah.
And sort of where I wanted to take that as well in relation to the wider discussion is I think we have to sort of introduce the idea of capital and capitalism as a libidinal force, maybe in the sort of Landian or even in the sense that Baudrillard talks about as well, where, well, why are these things happening? What do they sort of serve? And then what is the consequence? And the sort of thrust of this conversation has largely been around agency and human agency and what propels the subject to control substance, or what subsumes the subject into substance. And if we could say that reality today is basically constituted of the libidinal force of capitalism, that's reality, that's the simulation that we're ensconced in, then I think we have to look at how that relates to a lot of these things that are happening on a sort of deeper, the word used was parapolitical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, parapolitical level. And I wanted to delve into, like I said, capital specifically. Well, what is capital? What is capital in relation to the substance of I guess, existence today? But then also how that relates to ideology, how this relates to trying to sort of create this moralistic framework where these people on the right that try to adopt this leftist moralistic framework are essentially playing into the same, let's say, simulation that the leftists are promulgating. And let me just break this down because I use a lot of big words there. But in simulacra and simulation, there comes a point where Baudrillard is essentially talking about the idea of even revolution. And that even revolution serves this sort of, I like to call it an entropic negation, because it's almost like a reverse Hegelian negation. Instead of history moving towards this, ultimately good absolute, history is moving further and further away from, like, I guess, the anthropomorphic in a sense. And again, you get this with land as well. But if we look at why do all these things happen, what is the libidinal force behind a lot of these things? I think it is capital, because capital operates, under a set of inputs, outputs, and rules. Capital can be appropriated by the subject in a way that doesn't necessarily promote capital. One example I saw, this is actually from a pretty good leftist podcast I've been watching, run by a guy named Mikey Downs on Dangerous Maybe. But him and his co-hosts were talking about how sometimes the subject, meaning humans, will appropriate capital in a way that's just non-productive at all. For example, they brought up the example of 3D TVs at home. Like, nobody really gave a fuck about 3D TVs. Waste of capital that didn't end up actually promulgating capital. But key to the libidinal force of capital is its own promotion, own promulgation over time. Capital is trying to redirect all its excess towards, increasing its ability to accrue more capital. And the reason I bring this up, and this may seem like a big stretch, but in regards to all these things like ideology, moralism, and I'm going to bring Zizek into this, actually. See, sorry, guys, I'm not becoming a leftist. Don't worry, guys. This is all part of the plan. Trust the plan. I'm going somewhere with this. Zizek talks about ideology in a way where, of course, you have these people with essentially a very, let's say, diminished erotic will, which is fundamentally violent. But to be in the world, because they can't fathom of having agency, they can't fathom of having responsibility, they adopt ideologies as a sort of justification to be violent. This is how I interpret it. This may not be how Zizek meant for it, but this is kind of what I've taken from it. People adopt ideologies because fundamentally they want to be violent. I mean, you talk about, why does the Groyper support the Ayatollah or whatever? He wants an enemy, and he wants an enemy he can be violent towards. The left, why do they say punch a Nazi in the face, anti-fascist, whatever? They want to be violent, but they lack the courage to be violent in such a way that has an independent teleology. They need some sort of justification. And I think it's tied to capital and capitalism, because what do all these things ultimately sort of, go back to? And it goes back to this negative, what was the word I used? Entropic negation of capital, where all these things, no matter what, they don't really change anything in history. They don't really change the substance of history. They really just move it forward towards this repeated thrust, moving away from the referentials of the past and towards this slowly less anthropomorphic life. And then we talk about, why are people becoming more sexless? Why are people becoming more androgynous? And it's because they're losing the very essence of what it means to be human, which is violent, which is full of sex, pleasure, pain, the erotic. They're moving away from that, and they're moving towards this highly utilitized, highly structured mode of being, which ultimately ends up just circling back and moving the actualization of a sort of inhuman capital. So, like I said, it's like this negative Hegelian negation over time. And I really droned on, and obviously you're the guest on this show, so I don't want to go too far.
No,
But is
you're
any of
good.
that making sense?
It does. I think that there's caution to be had with seeing capital and everything, where capital definitely influences, how this culture war moves. But I think a lot of it is explicitly against capital's interests, and most of the people that are involved in moving money and power are they're not interested in making money, or even in the concept of making money, of making things more capitalistic in any way. um, on the other hand, you do have things like, for example, major corporations have supported the left wing project since 2014, and especially regarding immigration, because it leads to lower wages, but more importantly, it leads to a more predictable consumer base. People have done consumer studies on this. If you take like a New England wasp, he's significantly less susceptible to advertising than a guy from a Guianan favela or something along those lines. People from the global south are much more predictable consumers. And that's one way that the capital certainly has played in. On the other hand, so much of what we have now is like ultra moralism in service of power. So either argument of, separately from capital, you can say everything that we've done in culture in the past 10 years has been explicitly about power. And you can write a pretty good frame of history from that. Or you can say everything has been wars, a war between two different moral frames of life, and you can write a pretty good history from that. I think it's both of those things, though, because, for example, to use the State Department thing, you get to experience both at the same time. You get to be like a shrewd operator that's just doing things for the interest of the country. You're a cool psychological manipulator of things toward grand ends, but at the same time you get to be like a petty tyrant moralist and beat your opponents over the head with their rudeness or something along those lines. So it's like this terrible fusion of, at least in the United States, this terrible spiraling fusion of how things advance. um, with it being not, I want to phrase this correctly. Um, yes, via capital, we spiral away from the real, but it's less about spiraling away from the real and more towards spiraling toward the predictable. It's a The goal is ultimately an extremely predictable mass of people, which isn't like evil in itself, in the same way that others set it up to be, but it's terrible for humanity. It's a terrible incentive structure. If you don't have something to orient yourself toward, and I think you had that essay on accelerationism that talks about this. If you're not oriented towards something, you're just going to spiral into this, and that's the end state, is predictable nothingness. If you don't have an upward facing orientation, and that's what we're getting. Everything else is just a convulsion within that, but they're really big convulsions, and they've been pretty rough on the psychosecurity of the average person over the past 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess where I would go there is, we talk about these things supporting, power structures or whatever. But I guess I would say, well, why, right? Why do they want power? And again, I'd like to go back to Bataille on this, where you look at the general economy and you look at what happens with excess production, right? And I think on our side of things, which is probably the Turkmen side as well, is here's another thing actually, before I get into that. I would make the bold claim that everybody is either fundamentally an existentialist or is somehow intrinsically linked to an existential world outlook. And what I mean by that is ultimately ideology, all these things are some form of a nominal why should we, why and what do we do with our resources, our time, our energy, etc. Right? How do we express this erotic will? And of course, some whys end up expressing it more authentically, some more inauthentically. But ultimately, people need some form of nominal why. And of course, right, if you do believe in some form of an absolute, then your why would be ingrained into reality, right? So let's say, for example, regardless of what you believe in, whatever God, let's say you believe in a God, or gods, that's your why. and then everything I'm saying is kind of pointless because then that's what reality is created by. But at least from the perspective of the subject, right, without any sort of knowledge of what constitutes or like what creates reality, we're essentially nominally selecting reasons to be in the world. And my issue is, and again, when I talk about authentic and inauthentic, the reason I bring up capital in this regard and why I think it's linked to all these different power structures is there's no non-productive, glorious operation in the Bataille sense. People aren't choosing to just waste money on, like in Turkmenistan, creating these beautiful palaces that pretty much nobody visits, right? Because if it was a tourist trap and everybody was going to Turkmenistan, which maybe they should be, but if everyone was going there, if it was like Disneyland, then that clearly has some sort of productive purpose. You're making more
There's a
money,
commercial value.
right? But you see these people that do travel blogs to Turkmenistan. There's like no one there, but you have all this beauty that you can witness, right? But there's no one else there. And or even in Myanmar, I think this was kind of a glorious operation where they moved the capital in Myanmar to like a totally pointless place, and there's like no one there, but it looks kind of fucking sick. It looks a hell of a lot better than like some big, bustling Southeast Asian country. It's kind of cool.
Yeah,
But
you have to have something to do with excess production. And, we used to build cathedrals. That's always the example people use. It's like, oh, why can't we build the Notre Dame again? It's like, well, we have no reason to build the Notre Dame. That's why. We're bored. Like, we've decided that building the Notre Dame for any reason is just stupid. And even now, people who do, like, there's those French artists who are making, like, Greek statuary again. And it just comes across as very LARPy. Like, they're dressing in an old sense, and the statues they're making are very banal. It's not bad art, but it's very obviously art for art's sake, which even maybe gives it too much credit. It's just making something for something's sake. You have to have an actual orientation toward wanting to do these things. I think that's what you're getting at, right?
yeah, it's almost like what the sort of phenomena you're mentioning. To me, it's almost like a petty reactionary sentiment. Like obviously, at a certain point, we're all reactionaries on the right because modernity. Not saying we're completely reactionary, but even if you're a futurist, like I consider myself a futurist, you're still reacting to the fact that you don't like what encompasses most of the sentiment of modernity. So in some
Yeah.
sense, everyone's a reactionary, but we're also not necessarily conservative. And you could LARP in the woods and try to recreate these old rituals or whatever. And it's not to say there's anything bad with those things, but if it doesn't mean anything, if it's not pushing you towards any uh, trajectory, if it's just for the sake of doing it because it makes you feel good, then it's kind of like the slopification. It's almost like, what's that term? Cape shit.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
why are you doing it? You're doing it so that really you're almost doing it as a sort of narcotization. It's like, this is going to make me feel better about the fact that modernity is fake and gay, right?
See,
Um,
if it was just for that reason, I think it'd be better than what it is. And ultimately, the reason now is like for it's performance. Um, as a performance is worse because then you're putting off your reward from it onto the crowd, and the whole movement is supposed to be about disregarding the will of the crowd. The people are slaves. The mob is a woman, so on, and they instead you want validation from that same crowd that you're trying to spurn. This is, I think, the problem with most of the right's thinkers over the past 10 years. My friends excluded, but you get a lot of people that are like, oh, I'm a conservative and I'm right wing and I have all of these old principles, but I desperately want to be accepted by the left. And that's just not going to happen. You have to want something other than that. You have to want something for its own sake. Um, that's kind of the issue you run into with, like, you mentioned. I feel like using groypers here is almost like, I'm not a fan of these guys, but it's almost not specific enough or not broad enough. But types on the right that really want acceptance from the left. They want to prove in roundabout terms that the Dems are the real racists, even if
the
they don't
Nazis
say
were the
that
real
anymore.
communists.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Oh, actually, we support Hitler because Hitler was super nice to minorities, and it's like, what? Hey, it's just comical. That's the performance aspect. Like, you have to have something that's not for performance. That's what I get into in the third part of the book. I think cults are kind of the ultimate form of like what comes out of this. But I don't know if you want to jump into that yet.
Yeah, I think I definitely want to jump into that and then sort of tie that into the reassertion of the subject over substance. But really quick before we go to that, because I think before we get into the cult stuff, I just want to briefly delve into the whole your whole talk on ARG and then tie that
Oh
to
yeah.
like Gooner Acceleration, because I think out of that the cult becomes like the sort of, well, how do we solve this problem? So I want to bring that up, but really quick, I think it was funny that you brought up the performative aspect. I wrote down one of my old essays. I said like the medieval prostitute is more honorable than like an OnlyFans model today, because fundamentally the OnlyFans model, she wants to be accepted by people. She wants to be a whore, but then not be treated like a whore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas the medieval prostitute, she knows she's just doing it for money. She knows she's a whore. I respect that. I honestly, I'm going to say this now. I respect prostitutes and hookers and escorts and strippers a hell of a lot more than OnlyFans models, because there's like
Even
some,
just sluts, like even
yeah,
just like a slut who just likes having sex, like that's I've known people like that. They're more fun to talk to, I'll tell you that, than someone who has like performative delusions on social media.
if they're honest about it, right? Like they know
Yeah.
they're a slut and they're like, oh, this is, yeah, I completely agree, because all this, like, I mean, actually this directly goes back to everything you wrote about in regards to female sexualities. It's totally performative. It's totally like, I can, bang all these guys, but they're not actually doing it. Like, we're having less sex, even women are having less sex than the past. It's just like saying, well, I can do this, I can be a slut, I can, sell my titty pictures for $10 a month and make $300 a
Yeah.
month, end up not really doing anything. But anyway.
Well, it's moralistic, right? It's the same thing we do with violence. We do the same thing with sex. This was kind of I think the thrust of part one was the thrust, yeah. But is we sublimate these things into pure symbols. We do symbolic violence. Like we delight in other people doing violence. There's like a half of a fist fight on a live stream. We're like, yeah. It's like, dude, the Assyrians would flay people alive and put their skin on the walls outside of the city as a warning. We're in a very different level here. People don't even get into like bar fights anymore or schoolyard fights, much less, which is supposed to be a normal experience. Like we just turn it entirely into symbolism. We go and we watch movies for a symbolic experience of violence. You can see that in the evolution of the form of the action movie too. Um, and then with sex, it's instead of the actual act of sex, which is very like primal and vulnerable and animalistic. That's too unpredictable. We experience it through symbology, and that's what the OnlyFans thing is. Aside from the capitalistic reasons, like of, oh, I can make money doing this. Most of them aren't making any money, or are making so little money that it doesn't make any sense. Most people that post on social media for like sexual attention are not really making anything off of it. Making $10 here and there, or having somebody buy you a pair of shoes, that like it gives you like a fig leaf of deniability, but ultimately it's the sexual act turned into symbol, and you're just mating with the symbol at the end stage of it, which is what people are doing. Your essay talks about this with like, oh, I have like an LLM partner that I like role play with. Like you are literally mating with a symbol. That's all you're doing. One funny one that came up today was there's that subreddit. It's called r/fucking fascists, and it's a fetish subreddit for women that are attracted to fascism and that like the idea of like dominated by I don't want to say dominated by Doug. It's like dominated by Hans. Uh, the pinned post on that subreddit it's this whole fetish thread, and then the pinned post is like, just a reminder, actual real life fascists are disgusting. It's like your sexual impulse is being exercised by purely mating with a symbol. It's the actual physical act is abstracted. The actual emotional and real experience, the sensation of these things, doesn't exist anymore. Everything has gone into pure symbology, and usually these things are kind of awkward for people on the right to talk about, but they are funny, even if they're kind of sad. Anyway, that was a whole diversion on symbology and semiotic absorption of everything. But that I think is ultimately the force, because those things are more predictable. They're more constrained, corralled, moral in the neo moral frame. They're allowed. The actual thing is too raw and unpredictable for both sex and violence.
Yeah, I think this is going to sort of bring us directly into the whole ARG Gooner
Yeah,
Acceleration topic. But the last thing I'll say about that, which I guess kind of goes into what we're about to talk about, but as you say, I totally agree. And the word I've been using is like the commodification of the erotic, utilization of sex, turning it into a fix, simple input output, rather than this slow crescendo, rather than this becoming, right? Which is instead of the coming, it's a becoming. It should be a
Yeah.
becoming. Like, the best part about sex almost shouldn't be the release. I mean, I think it should be all the things that precede it. Even if you go to like Lacan and Object Petit A, like a lot of times the thing that we're actually deriving the most pleasure from isn't the actual what's the word I'm looking for? Like it's not the end of that process. And I think this is the big problem with pornography, with AI stuff, is that you just go straight to the end, right? With all these
Yeah.
things, you can go straight, not just the fix. That's kind of the very superficial thing we could talk about. But more than the fix, it's really just the idea of your desires being satiated. I mean, at a certain level, I think you should take this Lacan view of desire and you should sort of reread it as the beauty of desire is never fulfilling your desire or constantly expanding the threshold for how much sensation you can experience, which goes back to my whole thing with like this erotic evolution. But everything's just simulacra and symbology now, and I totally
Yeah.
agree. And this is going to go directly into what we're talking about. But
Well, yeah, there's this
um,
attempt to make man into an animal that doesn't want to experience violence or sex. And that's the ultimate drive. It's like a Fabian managerialist drive. And, obviously that's absurd. But that's where we're headed, and that's what all of these things are. They're just little stopgaps as we get further and further into it. But yeah, the social media ARG is absolutely, it's the social media experience gives you all of your like mental pleasure in life from performance. And we've everybody since the dawn of time, since the Greeks, has talked about how horrific of people actors are, and we're all actors now. um, for this unseen audience, and social media just makes that audience formal, which leads to the whole ARG. I didn't know if you had a lead in. I don't want to, I didn't want to cut you off too bad there.
oh no, you're good. I was just writing something down about what you said. But yeah, the unseen audience, like, or even the example you bring up. I remember as a kid, I hated watching people play video games. Like, yeah, let me fucking play.
Yeah.
Especially if it was like an older person game. I was watching like an adult play or like an older brother of one of my friends. Like, oh, let me fucking play. I want to play Call of Duty, and I'd be pissed off when I didn't get to play. And now you're mentioning the dad's playing Minecraft, and the kid goes up and is like, oh, nice, and it's like, oh, you want to play too? Like, nah, I'll just watch. Um, we are becoming voyeurs in a lot of ways, and we're being conditioned to be that way. And as we move, I'm going to have sort of have you introduce ARG in a sort of summary for the people that haven't read yet. And of course, you should buy a copy of the book. But the reason why earlier I sort of equated this to capital, and maybe I don't know if it's the same, if we're using the same definition necessarily. This is why there's a little disagreement there. But when you talk about predictability, when you talk about getting rid of that, I guess, flux and all these things, to me that's capitalism 101. Maybe not capitalism, but capital separate from the process of capitalism. Like, what is this sort of teleology of capital? And again, it can never be non-productive, right? That would negate the whole teleology of capital in itself. It can't be non-productive. It can't be excess thrown towards these sort of nominally asserted values. The subject can take capital and do that, but capital itself, if you're following the rules of capital, can never go beyond that. And I write about this a lot as well, and I want to write more about this in the future. But
Yeah,
I
that's
think
very
that,
fair frame that way.
yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because I think maybe
Yeah. No, no,
we're
absolutely. It's
different opinions.
the problem with just critique of capital in general is that most of the, not you, but most of the people who do this are like, they're insane moralists. And you'll get this with AI. Leftists all of a sudden care very deeply about the human experience when they talk about AI. But you ask them like, oh, like, what's your concept of humanity? And it's like, well, it's nothing in particular. They refuse to have any kind of like first principles thing that they actually like they don't like sex or violence. Those are pretty first principles in human nature. But they also don't like AI because it's capital. And it's incoherent is more the point. But yeah, it is absolutely a capitalistic move. The move away from predictability and the move toward interchangeable cog existence, which is ultimately what's happening.
And this goes directly into what we're about to talk about. So I guess
Yeah.
briefly, if you could just summarize what you wrote about the ARG, and then I think where I want to go with that is, of course, we gotta. I've been I've been trying to talk about Gooner Accelerationism as much as possible because eventually it's going to be huge, and I need people to know that I came up with it. But if you give a
It's a good
summary
term.
of, it is right. It's very catchy. That's why I said it's like half meme, half real. But yeah, if you could just briefly, or not even briefly, take as much time as possible because I think this is low key. Low key. I'm using the kid terms. This is like I think one of the most important parts of the
All
book.
right, Unk.
So,
Yeah, no,
are
it's
you?
well, with this. Okay, my core read of it is that social media functions as an alternate reality game, in contrast to the market. The market is an alternate reality game, but it's defined by like adherence to reality rather than shaping of reality. Granted, you can shape reality to some extent by interacting with the market. You can invest everything in 3D TVs you mentioned earlier. Ultimately, though, people didn't want 3D TVs, and as hard as you try that, you do have to reckon with some element of reality at some point. You can have an explosion of speculation. You can have the tulip bulb or the tulip craze of the 17th century or 18th century. But ultimately, those tulips have to provide value of some sort. You know, at the end of the day, you have to reckon with like what the earnings sheet says. That's the original alternate reality game. And if just for people not familiar, ARGs, something like Pokemon Go is kind of an ARG. Cicada 3301, if anyone remembers that one, that's probably the most famous like true internet ARG, where it's this mix of things you can find online, things you can find in the real world, and the game only advances by people playing it. I think social media functions as that, but contra the market, social media lets you shape reality by messing with it. So the more you input to, Twitter or something along those lines, you can get like real world changes out of that. Cancel culture for a long time. If you posted hard enough, like you could fuck up somebody's life. That's ARG engagement, and all of this comes down to, at the end of the day, it's just like Dragon Ball Z blasting forces at the other team, whoever you don't like. Um, via words, posts, memes, whatever. I can get more detailed than that, but like that's how social media functions at the end of the day in terms of like mass culture. It's all just this game where everybody knows that what happens on here will determine in some shaded form what actually happens in the real world. And obviously that's kind of insane. It's the same concept as like Platonic or Renaissance magic, if anyone's familiar, where like everything's connected by unseen spider webs of forces, and then if you pull on them just right, you can get desired ends to happen. Um, but it's not very direct. It's not like, oh, this post gets 10,000 likes, so we win the election in Minnesota or something along those lines. It's very indirect, and everybody interacting with social media over a long enough time span eventually starts talking like a 16th century mage about it. It's I'm just kind of putting out energy in this direction and things like that. And this is the medium though that rules our lives like far more than traditional media. Social media produces the content and ideas that traditional media engages with. Like most traditional media at this point, if anyone's seen the marketing rollout for the Odyssey, is like built specifically to make people on Twitter mad about it or come up in defense of it. And that's the easiest way to market anything nowadays is to, play on the ARG, give people a position to fight over. And then incidentally, you make a couple bucks off it. So everything is formatted around what's going on social media. Twitter is usually upstream, but not always. TikTok too. By the way, this is like explicit if you look at social media marketing guides and things like that. It's like, oh, UGC, user generated content, is the highest goal. You want to spawn discourse, controversy marketing, things like that. But at the end of the day, it comes down to politics and power politics because everybody who does it for long enough identifies that as the key axis, and everybody just spends all day, doing I'm going to post blue exclamation point, and that's going to get 70,000 likes. And someone's going to quote tweet it and post red with two exclamation points, and that's going to get 80,000 likes. And that's our form of culture formation now. Um, Granted, I don't know how heavy you want me to go because the essay that follows that one on how this functions with capital and with the technology itself is a whole separate point. But I think that if you're on social media long enough, you eventually start to recognize that it is like gamified heavily. toward that end.
Yeah, I want to go into the second part in just a second, but I guess briefly, sort of some of the thoughts I've had from what you said is going back to this idea. First of all, the last thing you said, this entropic negation, where any resistance against capital, in this sense, ends up just benefiting capital more. So you resist the Christopher Nolan Odyssey. And by the way, I just want to say, I actually don't think Christopher Nolan is to blame for this. I think he was forced to do a lot of the casting choices. I don't know for sure,
Yeah,
but I just
he's
get the
also
sense.
old. I don't think he
Yeah,
has a clue about any of this stuff.
yeah, I don't think he's to blame for it. And same with the marketing stuff, obviously. I just want to bring that up. But where I was going to go with that is even us getting mad at the Odyssey or whatever, posting, right? We're just building into this entropic negation. We're going back into the simulation. And any revolution, again, Baudrillard talks about this, anytime there's a revolution against the system, you're just making the system stronger and making capital stronger over time, which I think is interesting. But going to what you said specifically about ARG and some of the things that come out of that, even the idea of like, it's funny, like you have people buying virtual currency in a video game now, right? Which means
Yep.
nothing in real life, but it just means something in this video game. But of course, the virtual currency in the video game does have nominal value in the sense that it's put against the virtual currency that other people have in the game. So it's like it's a reality within reality. It's a hyper reality, I guess, in a sense.
Yeah.
And going from there, right? Let's see what I write down. You're just leaving. You're getting more separate from the referential, and you're just creating a reality within reality within reality. And then the last thing I wanted to say about that is the thing about that is, which I think is interesting and a little bit scary. And before I get to Gooner Accelerationism, I want to have you talk about the second part that you were going to bring up. But just really briefly, tying it to Gooner Accelerationism, in the ARG, at least there are other people in the room with you. You are interacting with other users, and there's some form of inequality. There's some form of stakes, even if it's simulated. There's still some, for example, I could be a better player than somebody else. I could have more clout on social media than somebody else. People are still engaged in this hyper reality. In the Gooner Acceleration, it's like Total Recall. You're the only person in the room. There's no longer anything that is fundamentally, what's the word I'm looking for? Like
Real.
limiting.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, what did you say?
I just said real.
Yeah, well, that totally. But the word I'm looking for is like, there's nothing. It's a better fancy term for limiting. Like, there's nothing. There's nothing really inserting any stakes into it because you're the only player. Yeah. You dictate everything that happens within it, and the issue with that is now there's really just nothing at all. Now, there's not even nominal fake value. Now you're just there, and you're kind of nothing at the same time. And the issue with that becomes that there really is no need for, if you commodify sexuality and you commodify the erotic and you use Gooner acceleration, it becomes, what's that term? Fully automated luxury gay communism, or maybe I didn't say the gay part, but fully automated luxury communism.
They automate violence too, like the social media ARG, you dunk on somebody, you're getting like a proxy for violence on them. It's the same thing. It's just taking those impulses and making them legible to a machine. The inputs and the outputs, really. Everything is mediated through that machine.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, that's why at least with the ARG though, right? It's a hyper reality. It's fake, but there's still some very thin referential where there's no referential anymore in Gooner Accelerationism, which I think is what's scary about that. I think the ARG is part of the process that reaches Gooner Acceleration. Like, these things are part of, I guess, a teleology, so to speak. But anyway, really quick, I need to go smoke break, as Baps. No, I need to go to the bathroom. But like Baps says, I go smoke break. I go smoke cigarette. So I'll be right back. I'll edit this part out, but I'll be back in like a second.
Yeah, you're good.
So I guess from there, we can go into what we were going to discuss after the ARG, sort of delve into that. Because like I said, I think that's really, I think, one of the most important parts of the book and this discussion. So take your time, go really deep into the weeds. We schizos will weed out and eugenically prune the normies from this podcast.
All right. Yeah. we've been talking a lot of like very airy theory, and I don't get me wrong, I love that stuff. But I think with technology specifically, because it's a technical, capital constrained medium, and because it's involved heavily with political power, I tend to view almost everything as like an aftershock of power politics in some way. Um, and the essay I'm referencing is the puppeteer industrial complex, which I'm actually going to post on Substack today. I have that queued up. But anyway, long story short, I'll say social media has no intrinsic value as it is marketed to investors. The game of social media, it's said that social media derives all of its value. It's free to use, but it derives all of its monetary value from targeted ad revenue. Um, However, the user bases have not gone up by that much. The usage has not gone up by that much since like 2020 or so. 2020 was actually a peak, and even before that, they weren't increasing at a rate commensurate with the earnings calls or the projected value of something like Google or Facebook or Twitter. Um, the justification for this was that ad algorithms were getting better and you could target people even more with marketing. I don't think that's true. I don't know about you, but I don't think my targeted ads have gotten any better at targeting me since 2018. There was like a moment around 2015 through 18 where all of a sudden they got like real scary accurate. You talk about, oh, I want to take a trip to New Hampshire, and then you get an ad for it on Instagram the next day. But it hasn't gotten any better since then. And this is a long way of going about it, but ultimately I think the clear value of social media is that it's like a machine legible map of the human cognitive atmosphere of the mass brain. It's a completely legible map of what everybody's doing and thinking at all times. And it's not a perfect map because you still have to interface with it through your thumbs and whatever your actions are. And further, those actions are justified by whatever your position in the ARG is and what you're trying to achieve. But ultimately, it becomes this commodified form of the noosphere. That's what it is. And all of these proclamations, for example, AI is, I think, a massive bubble, but not in the sense that it's traditionally said to be a bubble. People will say it's a bubble because we just want to throw money at chip processing. They'll give different justifications for why AI is overvalued. I don't think that's the case. I think that around 2018, 2019, the projected increase in ad revenue just wasn't hitting the actual increase wasn't hitting at the same level as that which was projected. And also 2019, that's when Attention Is All You Need comes out. And that's the basis for the large language model. And all of a sudden, everything's very, 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 very AI centric. 2022 is when ChatGPT launched. So not long after that. But if you look at all of these AI products, they were all launched with like scare campaigns, which makes no sense in the context of the actual technology. Which, by the way, AI is like proposed as this, dark black box type of technology. You can just run models on your computer. You don't need to, you can run models, screw around with them, do all of these different things. You don't have to use the enterprise models just as a thing. That's a good like personal tech sovereignty thing. You can do that. I don't have anything particularly interesting on that angle, but just a thing. Get LM Studio, go on Hugging Face, look these things up. Anyway, I digress. AI has been proposed as the thing that's going to end the world because it justifies infinite investment in the same companies that were, I think, bullshitting their ad revenue and were bullshitting their potential future value. Because everybody that's actually involved with these things, which to a large extent includes government and intelligence community actors, we saw this with the Twitter files. It was a revolving door between the CIA and Twitter, and it's like that with every social media apparatus and network. By the way, the people actually involved in it know that it's a proxy for power. It's this human noetic map that's machine legible and trainable and all of these things, and that's the actual value. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily turn out to like dollars perfectly, but it turns out to an immense amount of power. So there's this nonsense put forward about the end of the world and about infinite growth put forward toward investors, so they keep throwing money at it. But the actual value is in that a small eclectic group of people gets to control what everybody's thinking and seeing and responding to at all times. The ARG is part of this. The fact that it's gamified, that actually makes you a lot more legible to a system. If you're an actor on a team that responds in a definable way, that actually makes you more legible than if you're just like a a consciousness floating in space without like this back and forth team dynamic of things. Um, I'll pause there. What do you think so far? Am I is this enough depth or is this not enough depth?
I think it's pretty good. I think we go as we talk about more things. You'll probably go back to certain parts of that section, and we can bring them up. But I wanted to talk about, I guess, AI positivity. I don't know if that's the right word, but of course, there's there's like the accelerationist, effective accelerationist, and of course there's the Nick Land side where it's this very sort of dark, scary Thulu, you know, beyond the anthropomorphic sort of thing. And I think it's also important to recognize, well, why is there a lot of fear of artificial intelligence, and then is it warranted? Is it not warranted? Because I think there's a lot of nuance to this. I think it's related, though it's a little bit separate from the topics we've been discussing. But I think it's worth discussing. But in regards to artificial intelligence and whether we should be afraid of artificial intelligence, I just wanted to briefly give some of the what I think would be the positives and the negatives and see what you think. Because
Hmm.
first of all, on the one hand, technology over time has always had generally some decentralizing power. For example, of course, and this is perhaps the anti-trad sort of Holocaust. And what I mean by that is like when gunpowder and firearms, it kind of
Yeah.
made obsolete, right? Like a lot of these, you'd be 10 years of training, the way of the bow, the way of the sword. It was very beautiful. It was martial arts, right? Capital art. You take a samurai or a knight, for instance. But of course, once you even earlier, I mean, if originally you had a guy in a chariot, you had a guy in a horse, and then you have the infantryman, you have the pike line. Even that's a sort of innovation of decentralization, which is why the Greeks probably, I wonder, this is maybe a little bit schizo, but I wonder if there's anything to do with why the Greeks had a more libertine kind of culture. I wonder if it had anything to do with the fact that they built a military around the citizenry. I mean, maybe it's not so schizo that could you like being a hoplite wouldn't take nearly as much training as like a charioteer or a really high level cavalryman or like a horse archer, right? Like it was very much, about the unit, or even a Roman legionary, right? Like these people weren't training since they were kids. They a lot of them
Well, with
became
the
soldiers.
Spartans accepted.
Right, like that was the only exception. But then at the same time, right, like it's not like the Spartans crushed every Greek army. They were better, but how much better were they? I would say it's like kind of marginal. Maybe they were 30%, 50% better. But of course, it wasn't like all this time spent into training the Spartan gave them this insane advantage over the citizen hoplite. It gave them an advantage, but then you think about time put into it. I don't know, but anyway, I guess
Yeah,
I'm
no,
drawn. Yeah.
I think yeah, I agree. I mean, I go into the technological cycle of like innovation and decentralization later. Actually, I think in this essay, I have my own book open because I'm trying to remember what I wrote.
So do I.
No, with the Spartans in particular, I think that had more to do with like it was a utopian social experiment more than it was necessarily like just for military value, but it was using military might and military perfection as the axis or the venue to achieve that. They recognized war as man's highest pursuit, and it's like, okay, we're going to orient our entire civilization around achieving better warfare, and that was it was ultimately just a higher reaching impulse that used war as its substrate. Um, with the chariot, I guess I'll go into this a bit. Every new war technology, in particular, empowers a small mobile elite at first, at least, and then it's ultimately absorbed by, I guess, capital would be the best word here. The 16th century is the a massive time of new technology with gunpowder, of pike squares, of what do they call them? They're horse gunmen. They had like large pistols, and you'd have to rotate through the line. It was very very difficult tactically, but that was a novel thing. And all of it was ultimately like the whole 16th century was that being subsumed and being made legible to capital. How can you mobilize soldiers to do things with these new weapons in a way that advantages someone who has more money over someone who doesn't have as much money? That's ultimately the end of all warfare. It's whenever there's a new innovation, it's a time of disruption. The stirrup. The stirrup creates knights. Those are individuals who can do a huge amount on the battlefield. The chariot creates charioteers that are suddenly outsized power. Over time, you get more charioteers. Over time, you get more knights. Over time, you get settled infantrymen that can beat both of those. It's this cycle of disruption and then legibility. And I think the internet is one of those tactical developments in that right now, still now, the process is moving toward legibility, but still now you can have outsized influence if you're really good at posting on the internet, it sounds like an absurd thing to say, but think about how hard they came after Ricky Vaughn after the 2016 election. They tried to jail him. I forget, Doug Mackey. Yeah, I got to use his war name, but they tried to jail Doug Mackey because he had too much outsized influence on an American political election. That's a proxy for violence. And in the same way an election is a proxy for violence, being able to influence an election is a proxy for military might. Still today, you can have an outsized influence on elections. I guess the Ricky Vaughn for the 2024 election was probably Martin with the Haitian story. These are small scale things, but I think they're at least useful examples. However, with the ARGification of social media and the gradually more effective cognitive integration with social media, you train your body to have reflexes in a certain direction to interact with the ARG more accurately. It's this cyborgification process that gradually strips your agency from you because you can't take a step back and you can't do anything agentic. It's part of the same process that sublimates violence and sex into symbology. You're just gradually more and more becoming, sort of like you read Mike Ma's second book?
I only read the first one.
Gothic violence. He has this, I forget what he called them. I think he called them sirens or something. There were these giant structures that they put on the Florida border that made an immense, terrifying, kill you amount of noise north to cut off the border from everybody else. And you just eventually become one of those. You're just blasting in a direction infinitely. You have no agency of your own. You can't, form these aristocratic type small group, high flexibility, technologically enabled actors. That's ultimately the process here. The internet's a new war technology. NATO says as much. Everybody that matters spent the past 10 years talking about fifth generation warfare. And this is just making fifth generation warfare more and more legible to moneyed interests and major nations. It's stripping out the individual's agency within it. That's the process.
Yeah, and then looking at how that's going to manifest with artificial intelligence. I think this actually we can maybe go into Gooner Acceleration.
I didn't bring up AI. Sorry about that.
No worries. We'll definitely start talking about that. But at some point, hopefully I'll have you back on the podcast at some point. At some point, we should do a reading of the whole Lemurian theory with Nick Land. I don't know how familiar you are with that. I think that'd make for a fun episode. But anyway.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think that's actually relevant, but I'd have to read up more about that. But anyway, I digress. With Gooner Accelerationism, and I'll just briefly, I think everyone that watches my channel regularly knows what it is now because I talk about it almost every podcast. I'm hyperstatizing Gooner Accelerationism to become serious. I've gotten multiple PhD philosophers to say the word and discuss it. I've got Nick Land to talk about it. Got Jason Giorgiani. The guest I had on last week, Nina Power, is a PhD philosopher. So it's going to be real. I'm hyperstatizing it. But Gooner Accelerationism kind of follows the same cyclical thing that you're discussing, where initially it benefits the elites, and then it ends up sort of leading to some form of decentralization. Because, and for the viewer who somehow doesn't know what Gooner Accelerationism is by now, essentially it's this idea that as you start off with the ARG, but then you slowly get more and more sophisticated gameplay to the point where we're going to reach the technological threshold where we're going to be able to simulate reality. And this is going to be a lot easier than people think. So if you were trying to simulate all of reality and have it running at the same time that you were going to run the whole universe on a simulated model, that'd be impossible. We don't have enough energy to do that. But for example, in a video game, right, when you're walking through a map, the map generates as you walk through it. You don't have to simulate everything simultaneously. And I think this is how Gooner Accelerationism is going to work. We're going to be able to simulate reality. We're not going to have to simulate all of reality, but you're going to be able to simulate the user's interface with a reality, with whatever the reality of his simulation is, whatever he imagines or wants to be in for his gameplay. So there's that. Initially, that is absolutely going to benefit an elite that doesn't need to live in the simulation. Because you brought up earlier, for example, the WASP is less likely to be susceptible to advertisements than some Guyanan person. And I wrote about that in the essay as well, Gooner Accelerationism. It's going to affect certain demographics more than others. And it's going to tie down to, are you more consumer driven or are you more irrationally driven? So the person who's driven as a consumer is driven by utility, satiating certain desires, certain necessities, let's say. And the person who is irrational is going to go beyond that and say, well, life and reality are about, let's say, creating things. So who's that going to benefit? Initially, it's going to benefit an elite that can resist the simulation, that can resist this perfect, erotic commodification.
Well, specifically
whatever.
a cognitive elite, right? Like, it's not, if the last 10 years have shown us anything, it's that our like elite elites are mostly retarded and susceptible to psychological operations, if not more so than everybody else. It's a cognitive elite. It's a completely different ordering of precedence, right?
Totally. And, I mentioned that in the essay as well, is that if you're like a true thoroughbred capitalist whose, your entire life is about accruing more capital, why not just live in the simulation? That's going to give you all the sensational benefits that you get through playing the game of capitalism, right? You're going to get your yacht. You're going to get your 12, bimbo Russian girlfriends with lip fillers. Like, you'll have all that in the simulation as much as you would need to try to work for that in reality. So I absolutely agree with that. It would be a cognitive elite because the people that do, the sort of retarded elite, they're going to also be susceptible to the same things. It's going to be like, what's their point of being in reality if their reality is sort of dictated by the game? I mean, they're part of the ARG of capital, essentially. And they're probably also going to be subsumed in the simulation, because why would they have to be a part of the real world when sensationally they can get more of what they want in the simulation? Of course, this even goes back to something Nick Land writes about, where capital essentially is a flattening spiritually of elite to bum. And there's this idea of the Wall Street finance bro who becomes a cokehead, and he's buying his drugs from the same corner that some homeless guy is. Like, they're both addicted to drugs, whatever. Like, the spiritual flattening of the elite to the consumer. So this retarded elite that you're talking about is also probably going to be subsumed into the simulation of Gooner Accelerationism, whereas the cognitive elite, and this is where decentralization comes to play, because initially the cognitive elite is still sort of artificially hierarchical, because initially you're going to get the people who are in charge of orchestrating the Gooner Acceleration, the architects of Gooner Accelerationism. They're going to be the initial people that benefit immediately because they know exactly how it's constructed, and they're already in those high positions of constructing the architecture, that they're going to immediately benefit. But then you might have people who are in the upper middle class, the middle class, even the working class, who have the potential to be a cognitive elite, who say, okay, I'm not going to ensconce myself in the Gooner Acceleration in the simulation. I'm going to take this as an opportunity, because we're going to free up so many resources if we can actually get this done, which I outlined in the essay. We're going to free up so many resources. They make the jokes like a country of 100 million. Like, it's going to be less than that. We're going to be a country of maybe 1 million, theoretically. And this is going to free up.
At least, yeah.
Was that? Well, yeah.
Sentient people, yeah.
Yeah, because the other people are going to be in the Gooner pots. They're basically not there, right? They're going to be in Saudi Arabia, because we're going to pay the Saudis to build all those gnome smart cities and put all the Gooners in there. But because of that, initially, like I said, it's going to benefit the people who are first an actual elite, and they remain elite because they're part of the cognitive elite. But then it's also going to spread out to whoever resists the simulation. And it's going to end up decentralizing power in a sense, because now power is going to be spread out because with abundance, with all these excess resources, people are going to be able to do their individual projects. They're not going to need a human slave caste anymore. I mean, BAP talks about this as well, the potential future trajectory when you could just automate a labor force. You're not going to need all the retard peons anymore. You'll have robots do that. So you just need one architect who can function as a city, essentially, or you can function as this big corporation going and mining some planet wherever else, like an avatar. You need one person with a bunch of robots, and you can go colonize Pandora or Pantora, whatever the fuck it's called, and go bang some 9-foot tall, blue-skinned Navi and put your little hair with her, and you go,
fall for the Navi pussy.
Dude, it's gonna happen. Hey, it's better than being in the Gooner Acceleration. At least you're like,
I guess
you're in reality. That's like the true WASP. Well, I guess it's not really the WASP thing. It's more the conquistador thing. If you have the conquistador bro mindset, you got to go impregnate the Navi. And
you're morally obligated in the Spanish tradition.
It's part of their mode of being. Like, I don't really like Dugin, but Dugin talks about, he tries to use Heidegger to justify all these different cultural ways of being. Like, the Anglo way of being is liberal. The Russian way of being is more traditional. Like the Spanish way of being is to go fuck some Navi, hoe on Pandora. That's functionally part of their mode of being.
Dude, you know what the funny thing with that was? I learned recently that there was some account from like an interview with various Aztecs. Like they were kind of freaked out by how much the Spanish loved loved women, right? they didn't pursue sex or anything like that in the same way that the Spaniards did. And it's not just because the Spaniards are uniquely horny people. I mean, they are, but not solely because of that. It's mostly because the primary ecstasy in Aztec, like pre-contact Mesoamerican culture, was in the sacrifice and the battlefield triumph and things like that. Specifically in like the ecstatic, like torture someone to death moment. Like that was their peak ecstasy. It wasn't sex, so they were put off by how much the Spanish liked women. Complete non sequitur, just a bizarre anecdote. And I guess proof that you can really tune people's pleasure pathways or experiential pathways. You can tune them with culture and technology, and that's what's happening now. Is people are getting all of their pleasure, pain, sex, violence out of like social media engagement, and that's our end point.
Yeah, and briefly on the Aztec thing, I recommend everybody read what Bataille has to say about this in The Accursed Share. But I mean, sex is almost tied into human sacrifices because I don't know if you've read the passage I'm referring to.
Yeah,
but
no, I know it. I like Bataille on this.
Yeah, it's like, well, you can help jog my memory if I misspoke, but it's something along the lines of certain really handsome captives of war will be treated like really, really, really well for like a whole year, right? They'll be fed well. They'll have the finest clothes. They'll sleep in the best beds that the Aztecs could provide, and then like about a month or so before their sacrifice, they get 4 virgins, and they're supposed to like impregnate them or something. I might be mixing up some of the details. But that's the general gist of it. But sex
is generally correct.
Right. It's directly tied to the sacrifice because it's like, because of course, the reason why sacrifice is so important to the Aztecs is because the sun was a sacrifice of this weak, sort of lame god, who of course wasn't weak and lame at the end of it. But there's this, very triumphant, princely, handsome Chad god, but he's too afraid to go jump into this ball of fire and create the sun. He goes 4 times or 3 times, and he's not allowed to go anymore due to some ancient law. And this lame little, twink god ends up being the Chad because he ends up jumping into the fire. Maybe this is a white pill for all you twinks out there. You can be a god too, which is interesting. You remember that BAP thing where he talks about the guy who jumps into the volcano because he wants to become a god? Yeah. Anyway, I digress. But the Aztecs themselves sort of tie sex into the sacrifice because there is this sexual element to, okay, the guy who's going to sacrifice himself gets all these virgins. He's supposed to impregnate them. He gets lots of pussy before he dies. Pretty cool stuff. Anyway, non sequitur, as you said, but I just wanted to add to that because it's maybe that's a topic for a future conversation. But
with Bataille, it's on shared experience and shared sacrifice of, like you're breaking norms, but you're also sharing, you're putting aside the accursed share. You're putting aside something that's to be consumed for no reason whatsoever, which are all of those resources that are put into this guy, and then he himself is going to be sacrificed for effectively no reason. And that's a simulation of war. By this point in Aztec history, too, they weren't really waging real wars. They were waging flower wars, which were primarily performative and didn't result in a lot of deaths or anything. The only deaths were through sacrifice. So that pathway of like group violence was tuned to take place through sacrifice in this like ecstatic moment of festival fury, and ultimately we have a much lamer form of the same thing, where it's like, JD Vance is going to ratio someone on Twitter. Not that I don't like JD Vance, but
Right.
It's those are our pathways of like enjoyment of violence over others, or some lady gets domed by ice, and it's like, not that it's a bad thing to cheer for your enemy's deaths, but it's like, that's all we got. Come on, like, we could do better here. Again, the Assyrians, skin, walls, so on. And that's what's happening here, though. I mean, I would think, generally you have the Gooner Accelerationism feel of things. I think we're almost basically there already with a lot of this stuff. Like, you don't need to be totally psychokinetically or cybernetically like engaged in a system like pod style. You don't need to be that far to experience everything through that lens. And I think that's what's happening now. Most people's sexuality is primarily consummated through symbol. Most people's desire for violence is primarily consummated through symbol. And it's through the, black mirror rectangle in your hand all day. Granted, I'm a social media addict, so maybe I'm far worse off than others, but I can at least identify the endpoint, that like, we're there. That's what's happening now. The question is, who's going to be in control of it, and can you still act agentically when that's the mass case?
And that's a big thing as well that I've always thought about. Once singularity, whether that's literal or conceptual, like something approximating singularity happens, whoever has the wheels of power is going to have the primary amount of influence. So maybe if the leftists are in control, they're going to turn us all into troons, which would be terrible. I'm going to have to Mishima myself before that. But
the mass hacking.
Yeah, I'm just going to Mishima myself before that happens. The noble death. I'm going to get my void, and we're gonna, like in patriotism. You ever read Patriotism? Yeah, we're gonna do that. If a woman's not willing to do that with you, she's not the one, guys. She's not the one. If your girl's not going to commit suicide with you, like, she's for the streets. But actually, where I want to take this conversation is a sort of redefinition of fascism, actually, which I think is interesting, because if you look at the Aztecs, for instance, so Bataille has a whole essay on fascism where it's a critique of fascism, but it's also recognizing certain elements of fascism which rejuvenate this sort of anti-capitalistic, ritualistic value system. And the funny thing about Marx is sort of a reactionary in a lot of ways. If you look at his essays on like the Asiatic modes of production, I haven't really read them, but I'm planning on reading them, so I did a little bit of preliminary research.
It's more obvious with leftists today, right? Like, a lot of them are just anti-progressives. They're anti-progressives on certain issues, not all of them, but like they want to return to Neolithic Stone Age Longhouse life. They don't actually like modern Anglo technology and technologically ordered life.
No, precisely. And it comes down to, again, to capital, because these pre-capitalistic societies, and this is why Marx brings up the Asiatic mode of production. The one I remember is like Persia. I actually had a debate. I went on one of Haz's streams. Bad idea, because that guy's a fucking retard. Haz al-Din, and he just does not let you speak. But he was trying to tell me how, like, the Persian Empire were just they didn't have hierarchy, blah blah blah. They were they were there. How like the Groypers consider they like Disneyfy Hitler. Like, Hitler was this like wholesome chud. That's basically what he was trying to do with Persia. And I love the Achaemenid Empire. Okay, so it's not a critique from my perspective, but just why he was stupid. He was trying to make it seem like there were these these Disney people, whatever, and he's like, okay, well,
but I like it for good reasons,
right,
that kind of thing.
But no, the problem with Haz, just to go on a quick, I'm not going to really talk about this much, but the problem with him is he just likes the aesthetic of communism. He doesn't actually like communism, and that's why he's either retarded or willfully ignorant, because he's getting paid by, like, I don't know, the CCP or Russia. I don't know. I would respect it more if he was getting paid. He's not actually that retarded. If he's that retarded, holy fuck. But the reason I bring that up in the sort of Marxian reactionary position is that these are like anti-capitalistic societies. The Aztec society would have been very similar to the Persian Empire. So in the Persian Empire, the satrapies, right? They weren't a landed elite the way that medieval Europe was. They would be given temporary control, and based on how they controlled the satrapy, they would either get to continue or they could be removed by the emperor or the king of kings, whatever. So that was Haas's point. Haas was trying to use that to say that they were Disney, they were commie bros, they're wholesome chud. But I bring that up because the Aztecs were very much this sort of non-capitalistic society. I mean, the concept of potlatch, which or potluck, whatever, fuck, that Bataille talks about, right? Like to be a merchant was actually a very honorable profession, whereas the Japanese considered merchants below peasants, and then medieval Europe to some degree as well. Most aristocratic peoples, right, consider merchants the lowest of low. But the merchant in Aztec society was almost like a priestly figure, because instead of exchanging capital, he was exchanging honor through capital as the substance of honor. So honor was the subject over capital. Capital was subservient to honor, subservient to this non-productive, irrational force, which I think is a really important point to make here. The reassertion of the subject over capital, because that's not what's happening today. We're getting towards that predictability. We're going towards capital, substance being sort of, there's no more human subject in regards to the process of capital as substance. But here they're taking capital, they're taking these goods, and the goods are not being driven by a libidinal force of capitalism or capital. It's being driven by a libidinal force of spirituality. And it's nominal, sure, but it's much more beautiful. It's much more interesting. And I think where I want to take this conversation is where fascism, and of course a lot of people, fascism, whatever. I'm not talking about literal gentile fascism, but what's the core of like the fascist, right? The early black shirt. What does he represent? It represents this reaffirmation of the subject over substance by getting the Caesarian figure, which would be like Mussolini or whatever, or the capo regimes of different fascist combats, and saying the subject is going to be in charge of the substance now, in charge of capital. The masses are part of capitalism, right? I mean, look, if Baudrillard and Deleuze and Guattari had any balls, they would be fascists. Because ultimately, what reasserts the subject over capital, over the simulation, it's some form of fascism. It's taking all these people who are essentially substance, they're not subjects, and it's saying, I'm going to use you collectively for a specific irrational aim, which is not dictated by the teleology of capitalism. So I just wanted to bring that up and see if you had thoughts on that and agree. And sort of, I guess I kind of want to transvalue fascism, so to speak.
Well, it's just the notion of like, do you have a transcendent value, and are you willing to take that to a logical end? Not to Dems or the real racists this, but the modern communist is the same thing. These people are usually not like true communitarians or anarchists or anything of that sort. They usually have a transcendental goal of things. They want their solar punk brown future, and they want lesbians with their pod babies living in solar powered farms, doing poetry reading groups or something like that. That's their thing, and that's a transcendent ideal. It's an irrational ideal. It's not the logical conclusion of any of these things. It's also not the Marxist ideal of like, oh, a man will be a painter when he wants and a fisherman. The quote. I can't rip it off the top of my head, but it's very different. And ultimately, the question now is just like, who's going to be in charge? What's the grand project that we're going to look at? I think the left's grand project is disgusting and horrible. It's I don't know what's the word, infantile, I guess, but I think it's a disgusting project, and I don't want to be a part of it. But at the same time, there are people on the right who have no grand project either. Like this was the big problem with the neoconservatives, the Bill Kristol types. It's just like, what, we're going to continue importing infinity Mexicans to make GDP go up? Like GDP up is their grandest ideal, and platitudes about democracy. That's no way to live. That's no way to structure a society. However, separate from both of those, there's the state itself, like our state organ, which frankly, Trump commandeering the entire thing is awesome, but it makes it more difficult to talk about the singularity element that I've looked at, because he's just commandeering it. Which, granted, I think it's amazing, but previously, prior to Trump apparently you know, conquering these people with no resistance whatsoever. um, the deep state, quote unquote, its entire goal was like relitigating the Cold War forever. And you saw this with Ukraine. You saw this with, well, really predominantly Ukraine. And they just constantly want to be in that Cold War mode of being forever. And my concern is that those people are still there, and the singularity hits. The singularity to me, by the way, is I mentioned earlier that like social media is a map of the noetic sphere of the news sphere. When the map meets the territory and they're one to one, and both are being pulled toward the other, people are incentivized to become more legible to it. Just as the algorithms get better, you can ultimately just control it through like string pulling, through extremely esoteric string pulling. But you can have like an algorithm that functions as a causation machine. And it's like, okay, well, who's in charge of that causation machine? If the people in charge of that causation machine are the same ones that built it, they're DARPA types and CIA types and things like that, who blatantly did build the internet, and they're just going to keep litigating the Cold War forever. And over time, that doesn't, that can't be sustainable. So it's just going to derange into absurdity. We're going to get 2013 forever. Um, that's kind of my concern. So it's that completely lacks a transcendental ideal. It's entirely just relitigating this like flower war conflict that ended 30 years ago. Um, Now I think the actual fight is between whose irrational ideal is going to get put into place by force and mobilization of society against capitalistic interests. Is it going to be the lefts or the rights? I think that's like everybody, you know, worth their salt in terms of intelligence identifies that at some point. We've seen that. Like Nick Land wasn't a political guy until very recently. He was a completely apolitical figure, I would say. He wasn't leftward or rightward. And in recent years, he's pretty much identified, okay, yeah, these are the stakes, this is what we're doing, and he's picked his side accordingly. Um, Correctly, I may add. But yeah, so I'll hold off there. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I think I would sort of summate it with the problem with the left, or let's say communist at its biggest extreme, and then everything from there is sort of just moving away from that extreme, which is probably the most honest. Is this is definitely a very broad statement, so it shouldn't be taken too literally. But the sense I get with fascism versus communism is that communism tries to remove capital from the equation entirely, effectively, which is impossible. Whereas fascism accepts that capital is, it's an intrinsic part of the substance of reality, but the purpose of fascism it's not to remove capital from the substance of reality, but
Just
to
to
find a
make
way
it
to
subservient. Yeah,
exactly to commandeer
yeah.
it the same way that the Aztecs essentially did. And I think this is why someone like Bataille still has there's almost like a reverence for fascism in what he says about fascism. He's clearly not a fascist, but he's also identifying certain aspects of fascism which are in every way superior to Marxism. And again, why I would say fascism of the potato is a valid critique of D&G, because I love reading D&G, and I'm not not going to say anything else, but I'm I'm effectively I'm sounding like the fascism of the potato right now. But Trump is interesting because the problem with Trump is like most people that support Trump support him for the wrong reasons, and most people that hate Trump supporters would never get the nuance for why someone like me or you like Trump. Like we're not these crazy, idiot hick neocon types, or not even neocons, but we're like, all right, I'll say my reason for supporting Trump, right? And why I'm 100% behind him. Clearly, Trump himself is a product of substance. He's a product of history, right? But he's a product of substance and of history that is enabling a reaffirmation of the subject through us, right? He enables people like us to actually function as public members of society without needing to hide, without needing to censor our speech. He allows But yeah, I was saying that somebody like Trump, he's not necessarily the subject himself, but however he was historically determined or historically came about, he allows a reaffirmation of the subject through, I would be so bold as saying, people like us, people at the sort of edge of the culture war who are engaging with theory or philosophy or politics on some sort of niche level, but inserting a new perspective. And somebody like Trump, he just allows us to have that free speech to be able to talk about it. He allows us to actually, hopefully, eventually, if Vance wins in 2028, make a living. I mean, this thing with ICE is kind of like crazy that essentially every chud can get a job being a chud. It's fathomable. Like they're actually hiring everybody and paying so many people. I'm in college right now, and maybe I'm a little too aristocratic to be the ICE agent. I'll just be the theory cell, whispering to the ICE agents from behind the scenes. I did my time in the Marine Corps, so I'm good now. But but like, do you sort of agree with that approximation of like what Trump represents?
Well, yeah, in far less interesting language. He's the only good thing on TV right now. He's the only person doing anything in the world. He's just like blatantly the main character. That I don't think you can make an argument for anybody else. Maybe Musk, but even Musk is in service of Trump. Um, like he's just the protagonist, the world historical protagonist. That's what I want. I want forward momentum. I want things to become more interesting and grand projects. Um, I'm against stagnation and whatever the hell has existed for the past 10 years. So yeah, it's much less flowery language on my part, but yeah, that's it basically. He's a historical actor that's able to actually act. Um, yeah, we've broken out of the miasma of the past, the post-war world. Maybe I'm overstating here, but seriously, like we've thought that war is this like gradual slog process observed by international observers and involving nation building and stuff for 60 years at this point. And then we go into Venezuela, take out the leader in a night, and we're home by morning. That's a complete rebuke of what everybody has thought is, the state of things for decades. Um, and it's just incredible. Like, oh, actually, you can just deport immigrants. You can actually just have like sensible national policy. You can just do things. That's why that's such a powerful phrase. Nobody thinks you can just do things anymore. Um, it's kind of funny that like our elite, especially technical class, like the San Francisco types, like that meme hit it off so hard with them that you can just do things. But these are people who are largely like educational elites. They've gone through life at at a pretty high pace, but that also that tracks with being suppressed, like your ability to do things being suppressed. So the notion that you can just do stuff, like you don't have to ask permission, is huge. It's immense to them. Uh, and I think Trump's the same phenomenon. It's you can just do things. Um, so yeah, I'm very hopeful for the political future. Honestly, I think things are going very well. Culture that's its own thing, but I also think that the bizarre technic state of where we are lets people with little resources and a lot of merit or intelligence do things that they would not otherwise ever be able to. Like now is probably the best time in decades for like an artists collective or something along those lines. In my book, I pose it as like cults, but I think you just have to be a cult to not get propagandized into some bizarre end. Either way, you can still do grand projects, and I think Trump himself is a grand project. Like he's saying stuff to people on Twitter. He's enacting policies that were originally tweets. You know, it's immense.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think where we can kind of, since we've been going for quite a bit, we can sort of start to close the conversation down around the cult, because I think that's related, especially to this sort of transvaluation of, well, what is fascism? But a couple of things I'll say before passing on to you about the cult is this whole thing we're talking about where technology begins as an instrument for the elite and then leads to some form of decentralization. Same with media, the internet, whatever. Like people are retarded because of technology, because now you can sort of force people's opinions to fall within, the CNN, blah, blah. But at the same time, it initially starts like that. But now nobody really watches mass media anymore. I mean, granted, Tucker Carlson's been kind of a little bit insufferable lately on some of the things he said. But the fact that Tucker Carlson left Fox News and he took the entire audience with him, like they don't
Yeah,
really give a fuck about Fox News anymore. That proves that you don't really need to be a part of the system to to have a wide audience, to have an impact, to have influence. So it starts off as a tool of the elite through mass media, and then it becomes decentralized. And hopefully one day, the Warrior Philosopher podcast Barron Trump will listen to it, and while he, you know, while he runs for a senator, and he's like, good idea. I'm gonna do that. Let's accelerate the Goonerism or some shit.
Well,
But
even like mainstream news, I watched Gutfeld the other day, and it was just a relitigation of what people said on Twitter like 6 days prior, like word for word. It's insane.
I mean, Twitter updates news quicker than media. I mean, I'll like I used to look at like I used to see something on Twitter, and I'd look to see if it was real by looking it up, and I wouldn't see anything. I'm like, oh, this is fake. Like when Trump was shot, I wasn't watching the rally live, and I was just seeing everywhere on Twitter. I'm like, this is bullshit. I don't see anything about this on Google. And then like 10 minutes later, it popped up. Right? It's like this is faster than news and media at this point. Like this is more immediate. Now, of course, a lot of slop will be involved in that, but yeah, it's completely changed the game, and I think it illustrates what we're talking about with technology. But before we get into the cult stuff, just the last things I'll say on that general gist. Yeah, it's funny, like the Trump thing where he said like my morality is, what did he say? Something like
Yeah,
you
the
remember the
only thing
tweet?
limiting me is my own morality.
Yeah, it's
It's
like all right,
awesome.
Nietzsche. There we go, based. Um, but I mean, you could just do things, right? And again, the thing with fascism, and the thing that Zizek says about fascism, which I agree with, is he essentially says something along the lines of fascism is the only honest ideology, because the whole point of fascism is to make fascism stronger, right? If you're like, you have the fascists, the whole point is to make your boys stronger, to make the fascists stronger. But that's what every ideology is trying to do. They're just not honest about it. They just lie about it and pretend, oh,
Yeah,
we're doing this for some moral purpose. Liberal freedom is bullshit. Marxist, is bullshit. Fascism is the only honest ideology. I mean, I hate the word ideology, right? Get rid of it. But it's the only one that says, yeah, we're doing it for our own purposes. Well, no shit, you are. Everyone else is too. And this is kind of why I don't like when they try to sort of concretize fascism into like a philosophical doctrine with like Giovanni Gentile. Not that it's terrible. It's not terrible, but I mean, at base, fascism, I think, is not an ideology. It's not supposed to be an ideology. It's supposed to be
it's not
this
a
sort of
universalist ideology.
right, right, exactly, right. It's not moral. It's just the impulse. It's the erotic manifest through action, through fucking, through violence. I mean, D'Annunzio was really, in a sense, the perfect fascist. He may not have been the exact ideological fascist, but what did he do his whole life? He fucked. He went to war. He flew a biplane over Vienna. He marched on the Fiume. He did coke, right? He had a samurai friend who went around with him everywhere. Like that guy was a fucking fascist. That's what I think of when I think of a fascist. I think of a guy like D'Annunzio. I think of a guy like Italo Balbo, right? Like that to me is fascism. It's not an ideology. It's for lack of better words, a vibe. It's an energy. It's this impulse towards. It's the imposition of the few against the many, to quote the Son of the Century biopic show.
Yeah, absolutely. This is why basically every historical figure we look up to, left or right wing, nominally was, would be termed a fascist. Now they have no pretensions toward like universal moral sympathies or things like that. And you see too when people style themselves fascists and like to do the universalism thing today, like you see that it just makes them deranged. They do the whole, oh well, I want an ethno state for me and an ethno state for you, and it's and then it just leads to you being like, glory to the Ayatollah. We will take
Right.
out these Western dog invaders. It's like, well, come on, man. You're being ridiculous. It's not a universalist thing, and it can't be a universalist thing. The great moral issue now is this idea that you have to believe in a moralistic universal frame, that man is a progressive animal, that's the only way that things can advance. And like true fascism, for lack of true fascism doesn't concern itself with that at all.
I think the only universalism that exists in fascism is essentially will to power. That life is a struggle
Yeah.
for power, and you could apply that to any people. Any people can be fascist, right, within their specific cultural frame. But the whole point of fascism is essentially for different fascist countries to fight against each other and see who's the best, in a sense, right? Like you can't really have this, like the way you could have a communist world alliance. You couldn't have that with fascism. I mean, at a certain point, if Germany and Japan somehow won World War II, they would have duked it out eventually, right?
Oh yeah.
Um,
Like
or
10
like
years. immediately.
Right. Or yeah, it would have been even sooner than like Man in the High Castle, probably. Um, Same with like fascist Italy. Fascist Italy and Germany, like fascist Italy would have essentially been subsumed into. I mean, I actually don't consider Nazi Germany exactly fascist. I think it's a little bit different, but that's a separate conversation for another time. But yeah, I mean, it really is an energy and a vibe. And the only universalism of fascism is the universalism of life, that life is struggle, life is erotic, life is full of this youthful vigor. I mean, what is the song of the fascists? It's Giovinezza, right? The youth. It is impulse. It is erotic. It is energy. It is Dionysian, but without glazing that anymore, I guess we can kind of start close off with the cult and maybe relate that to some of the stuff we just discussed.
Yeah, well, I mean, I even cite Bataille in the third part of my book. That's sort of the thrust of the third part is, what next? What do you do? Um, we have this world being subsumed by simulation, and people have always been cattle, but they're cattle in a different form than they are now. And you, to some extent, are cattle, like you, the reader, the royal you. Like everybody is subsumed to this in some way. So what do you do? Yeah, I quote Bataille a bit on like transgression as a cultic phenomenon, and on liminality, like this unsureness or between state as I don't know, as a state of strength or something to lean into. But generally, with how things are, with psychological operations and symbolism eating everything alive, I think the only agentic actor is like a small group of people. Now, it's a small group of people that are the only way I can describe them is as a cult. Like you have to have such insanely delusionally strong beliefs that they're completely unshakable by the strongest propaganda apparatus in all of human history in order to do anything. If you're willing to cater to whatever the mass delusion of the day is for even a second, you're not going to be effective. You're not going to be able to do anything. Um, I see this like tactical necessity for strong belief as like the baseline of a return to religion. Now, I'm religious myself. I tend to run afoul of most of the traditionalist religious types online. Actually, almost all of them, with the exception of like my friends. That's about it. But there's this notion that, oh, we have to return to religion because religion brings good social mores, and religion brings family values and marriage and things like that. It's like I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think people are going to buy into a totalizing framework that they've been propagandized against for their entire lives just for the vague notion of like socially we'll have marriage. That's not a strong enough motivator. It's not direct enough. um, I do see people kind of developing into cult-like organizations with specific quasi-religious beliefs based on tactical necessity of like, I want to do things, I want to make things happen. We have to be completely dedicated to whatever this thing is, and all of our ideology is going to sprout from that. Um, this is more of a secular, maybe an ethnic example, but like the guys who started the Iraq War, and I'm not doing an anti-Semitism. They wrote about this in Haaretz magazine. Ari Shavitz, take a guess, but Ari Shavitz wrote about this in Haaretz magazine, and about a group of about 25 Jewish neoconservatives conceptualized and implemented the Iraq War because they had ties to each other and to the state of Israel that were much stronger than their ties to the administrative state, to ideology, to the news cycle or secular, not secular, but sectarian politics. They had stronger ties than those things that everybody else concerned themselves with. So they were able to act effectively toward their end. Granted, it wasn't a good end, but they were able to act toward that end. I think that's kind of the basis. A small group with incredibly strong allegiances and incredibly unshakable beliefs, which are necessarily cultic or religious. Those are the people who can actually do things in the modern information environment. And the modern information environment is one and the same as the modern warfare environment. Again, NATO says as much. Everybody in the military says as much. It's part of the battlefield, if not the preeminent part of the battlefield now. So you need these you need cults basically. If you don't have a cult, you're out in the dark. You're alone. You have nothing. If you don't have a cult, um, I tend to see that as the basis for doing anything. I don't know. What do you think? This seems like something you would have thoughts on.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I guess the only area where I would diverge a little bit is I see the process of religion as something that should be inherently like the whole point of religion is sort of to assert the infinite perceived by finite beings. Maybe in like a Heideggerian sense, I could frame it that way.
Yeah.
Whereas I see religion as something that should be progressively infinite. So what I mean by that is, I think that, for example, Gentile tried to do this with fascism, and like I said, I prefer to not view fascism within the doctrine that Gentile offered. But one thing that he said was like the state essentially replaces religion as the ultimate overarching why that unifies everybody. And then fascism itself becomes a religion. And what I like about that is it becomes this almost like a nominal, malleable sort of thing. Like the state itself, like I guess what I'm saying is action is tied directly to religiosity. So, for example, where you could have two Muslims or two Christians, maybe two Jews. I don't know. Yeah, I guess so. Like Hasidics or a lot of them are very, or the Orthodox are very anti-war, right? Like you could have two people who are part of the same religion who politically are in opposition to one another. So like if religion is really supposed to be the ultimate identity, which it should be, right? Technically speaking, if you're truly religious, that would supersede all other forms of identity. That's the most important form of identity. So then I look at that and I say, well, if it's not the most important form of identity, right? If it's not treated as such, then there's a problem. So to me, my ideal cultic form would be sort of the creation of a religion that's tied to asserting the infinite through being as a finite being, not to use the word being twice, where I would take this almost like Promethean view of religion, where you tie it to the Titanic, and by Titanic I mean like elemental reality, and you say, okay, we're going to assert the transcendent from the material. We're going to take what we have here, and we're going to go towards the irrational, towards the non-productive, and say this is our why. This is what we're working towards. The cult is centered around this whatness of whatever is at the center of our identity. And for me, that would be something approximating an organ, which could be the state or imperium or whatever, right? Like something that we can expand, that we can say, I am part of this, that person is not part of this, to be able to make friend enemy distinction and then go from there. But I think fundamentally, we have the same general agreement here. I would just like, for me personally, and where I see the strongest form of identity coming from, it comes from a religion that is essentially man-made, but it's not materialistic at the same time. Like it's sort of part of a process of becoming towards the transcendent, rather than saying, here's the transcendent before, and we're going to like actualize the transcendent, in reality. For me, it would be like, there is no transcendent beforeness or primordial transcendent absolute. We're going to create that. We're going to nominally assert that from the position of finitude, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's because we live in a despiritualized or a disenchanted world. You have to do that in some kind of structured way, and you have to reckon with the unreal or the more than real in like a very specific ordered way in order to initiate more people into it, or in order to build a group cohesion. Because today people are religious online, at least. You mostly encounter converts. Some people might have been like I was raised Catholic. I'm still Catholic. I'm just saying, like, since I was a child, and you'll meet people like that. But most people are either literal or spiritual converts, especially to Christianity, where they have allegiance to Christianity for like political or moral reasons. They're not really, as lame as this sounds, they're not they're not experiencing the light of God like the born again evangelical types would say. They're not having ecstatic experiences. They're not snake handling. They're not speaking in tongues, things like that. That's not their conversion moment. It's reading enough stuff online and deciding that this is the correct thing to do. For me, I think then the ordered initiation is through liminal experience. You look at Greek mystery cults, things along those lines. Um, like ritualized, not necessarily, dance around a fire, ooga booga stuff, but ritualized indoctrination into some form of reckoning with the liminal, with something that's not quite real. That's what religion is, but it has to exist physically. It has to be something you actually experience to make it a real force, rather than something that's purely intellectual, which is how a lot of religion exists today, or an ethnic identifier. Like Islam, there's a lot of converts to Islam. It's like mostly just to ally yourself with the sort of third world brown, like vanguard. That's the reason that people convert to Islam, and you need to offer something more compelling than that, and it's necessarily going to be for a small group of people. This is one place where I disagree with Bataille. I think he has a too universalist frame of things, wherein ritual, I think he thinks ritual is more powerful than it is, because even historically, I guarantee you, if you looked at the Aztecs, most of the people, the commoners going along with these festivals and things, are just doing them because that's what you do. But they don't need to be initiated into the methodology of like how honor functions, and how and how the gods are expected to interface with reality. They don't need that. They just need to have like a rhythm around their lives. However, the people that actually matter, the aristocracy, the elite, those people need to have some kind of serious education in this. And for me, with no central institutions offering this, that looks like a cult. That looks like a cult oriented around liminal experience, and oriented around these things out of tactical necessity, because they want to do things. Wanting to do things is the base impulse, and then everything is built on top of that. Um, yeah, I think I'll probably also post the on liminality essay like next week or something. I've just been putting up the essays from the book on Substack, but that's my argument for religion in the 21st century. Um, there's the obvious arguments like, oh, it's better, to be religious. You don't want to be a deracinated, atheistic, nothing. But that's my more precise take on it. I see that as the future of all action, really.
Yeah, I of course, like I said, I agree, just with my own caveats
Yeah.
for what religion would be. And I guess sort of the last things I'd say, I think it's great what you said about these people, these converts. Actually, funny enough, I don't know if you'd believe it, but I was also technically raised Catholic. I guess, like, not really. Like, I went to Catholic school my whole life, and I was
Oh, you're
baptized.
more than
Like,
me then.
well, yeah, but like my parents weren't like you know we're cafeteria Catholics, I guess. My grandma was very Catholic. She tried to teach us some stuff, and then she got tired of it, I guess. But I went to Catholic school my whole life, pretty much, like from second grade to high school, like all of high school. Um, but what you said about the converts, it's interesting because it's almost like going back to the utilitarian versus the irrational. Like, they have a utilitarian reason for becoming religious, which I think is probably wrong. It's going back to Zizek. He has this quote, and I think there's a way you can interpret this quote properly. He says, "If you have a reason for loving someone, you don't really love them." And I think it's the same with religion. The whole point of religion is faith, right? That you don't need proof of your religion. Then it kind of defeats the purpose of religion in the first place. The whole point is and not even I'm choosing to believe this. I just believe this, or I don't believe this, whatever. If you did like a spreadsheet of like Islam and Judaism and like some form of Christianity, and you did your spreadsheet, and you're like, okay, I've determined that this is the right religion. And clearly, you don't really believe in that. It's kind of funny. It's like the reason like a lot of people are becoming Muslim, like Sneeko becoming Muslim, or Andrew Tate or whatever. Um, it's funny. Or like, for example, if you were really utilitarian about religion, you should just become a Mormon. Because first of all, you're going to get all the benefits of like being Jewish, because you have a
Oh
close,
yeah.
tight knit group of people. They're all really good looking people. And by
I
the
was gonna
way,
say the women are very
and
attractive.
they give all right, this is kind of a conspiracy theory, but they basically give you a wife if you become Mormon. They will get some cute Mormon girl to like make sure you go to church and fall in love with you, and then boom, you're in the church. Like, this is a thing. So I'm just saying, all you chuds out there, if things are really fucked up, and you have nothing else to do in life, just become a
Salt Lake
Mormon.
City, 2-3 years, forget, brother.
Exactly,
Fucking
exactly. Jeez, that's funny. Yeah, well, I mean, the point being that if you're joining a religion for the benefits, there's like this. Obviously, that Young Sheldon show is kind of stupid, but like, I never watched it. I saw a clip from it where Young Sheldon, he calls up a Jewish rabbi because he wants to become Jewish, because he's like, oh, this is most of the Nobel Prize winners are Jewish. I want to be Jewish, blah blah. And the rabbi ends up giving this really nice answer, which is kind of funny. But I totally agree with you on that. And I think one thing, I'm going to glaze myself a little bit. One thing I never did, right? obviously I'm a Happa, so it becomes a lot more difficult to politically identify with something that's beneficial to me. But it would have been the easiest thing for me to become a Groiper, right? I could have done the whole
Yeah.
Groiper shit, right? Oh, hail Fuentes, whatever, and it would have worked out for me. I would have been fine, because the Groipers, they only care that you're not white if you're not a Groiper. If you're a Groiper, then they just kind of give a blind eye to that. So I could have become a Groiper, but I didn't because I'm principled, I guess. I could have become a Muslim, whatever. Instead, I decided to flow in the wind, and I have to nominally create my own identity in the absence of one, which is going to be
Dude, you could be
the.
running in Sneeko's crew,
That's right, I could be,
doing
but it's
trips to Haiti.
that's well, maybe there's a utilitarian reason for me not doing that, right? But instead, I'm creating the Hapaborian fascist state in like the Philippines. I'm gonna slowly turn the Philippines into like a fascist Hapaborian super state, and we're gonna colonize the Chinese and the Indonesians and do all sorts of crazy shit. Become an American proxy state.
Oh,
Anyway,
you know what? Actually, I wanted to mention because you said the needing proof element, and I think that's I think in the essay I do well to like diffuse that as the notion like behind why you should seek liminal experience. But it's not about proof, at least to me. It's more on you have to re-reckon with those physical things that have been absorbed into symbols, like sex and violence. You have to re-reckon with those. And I know this is off subject here, but with like training mixed martial arts, for example, a lot of guys do that and they start as like I started when I was a kid, so I can't map one to one, but a lot of guys start training and it's like a ritual thing almost. It's this transformation happens in you because you've reckoned with violence. You're going through this constant process of reckoning with hierarchy and violence and pain. I don't know what that looks like for sex, frankly. Maybe BAP's sex cults episode is the is the answer there. I don't think so, but it's close to it at least. Anyway, that's more my point is that you have to reckon with these things physically and ritualistically, and they're naturally liminal because they can't be captured by a computer, at least not fully. And that's the basis for retaining normalcy. That's what I mean by tactical benefit. I needed to put that out because I just remembered. I was like, wait, I have to caveat this.
I feel that way sometimes when I write an essay. I'm like, oh shit, I should probably clarify this. But yeah,
Yeah.
funny enough, I totally agree with you about the MMA thing though, because for me, I I guess my reason for starting MMA was both ritualistic and kind of utilitarian. It's really funny. So first of all, I started wrestling because I was kind of a little bit smaller my freshman year, and there was this girl I liked, and she was like, I went to an all boys school by the way, so meeting girls is very difficult. But she was like kind of dating this like big football guy, and I was like, all right, I should probably know how to fight, So I started wrestling, and then the reason I started MMA specifically was like 5 months later, I had I went to go watch Conor McGregor fight Nate Diaz, and of course he lost that fight, the first fight. But then
It was a
in the
hell of a
weeks,
fight.
it was a hell of a fight. And then of course he got his revenge, so it's all good. But the week after, like literally that same week, I was like, I'm gonna become this MMA fighter. I had a crush on this celebrity, Sophie Turner, Sansa Stark from Game
Yeah.
of Thrones. Yeah, I had it in my head that if I became a famous MMA fighter, that I could date Sophie Turner. It's kind of funny. I mean, I was like 15, so it was like kind of a childish fantasy. But whatever, these things are good. You should have more
It's more
childish fantasies.
historically normal than like anything else. So
Better than being a troon, right?
yeah.
But like then I did like 600 push-ups, 600 sit-ups, and I got really sick because like I was going too extreme. And for like 2 weeks, I had the flu, and I was just watching Conor McGregor videos for that entire 2 weeks. And I just wanted to be him. It was like a mimetic sort of thing where I just wanted to be Conor McGregor. I was so enraptured by this figure. And then once I got over my sickness, I joined an MMA gym. I got pretty good. I got to the point where I was training at American Kickboxing Academy for a bit. I was like doing
Good
jiu-jitsu
gym.
tournaments all the time. Yeah, very good gym. I got to meet like I think I fist bumped a few of those big guys, like Islam, Habib. Funny enough, I have a funny story about DC where I was in the pro jiu-jitsu class, like with all the pros, which was like an invite only thing, but I had been going a lot, so my coach invited me to those. And I was sitting next to one of my friends, and DC looks over at us and says, "I heard you've been talking shit." I didn't know if he was talking to me or my friend, but I was kind of excited. I was like, "Oh shit, I've been talking shit about Daniel Cormier." But he was talking to my friend, and he goes up to him, he starts browbeating him about how he was talking shit about him, and the guy's like, "No, I wasn't. I wasn't talking shit." He's like, "No, I want you to talk shit. You should be yourself. Be confident or some bullshit like that." that's just one of my fun stories of Daniel Cormier. Anyway, I don't know why I brought that up,
Classic
but
DC corny anecdote. That's awesome.
dude, he was so corny. Good guy, but corny. Also, I saw Ali Abdullah Sleaze there before. Fuck that guy. You know Ali?
Is he the
Terrorist
one?
snitch.
Is he the
He's the
is he the
terrorist
coach or the
manager
reporter?
of Habib. He's the
Yeah. Okay.
manager of
The
Habib.
coach.
Yeah, terrorist
Yeah.
ass. Anyway, he was there a couple times. But anyway, yeah, roundabout way of saying I have a similar kind of experience at MMA, and if I stuck with it, who knows what happened? But I'll have more influence as a theory cell, squadristi intellectual than I ever would have as an MMA fighter. Like this was my historical substance, was to become a fringe philosopher. We'll see what happens. Maybe I'll make it. But anyway,
the MMA thing, man. Come to Thailand. Come
are you in Thailand?
No, I'm not right now. But no, I was talking to some of my friends about setting up a trip, going over and training, fighting over there. It seems fun. I don't know. It's like there's like a weird tropical zone. Yeah, a little tropical island at the edge of the world where like everybody who goes there to fight or to fuck.
Yeah, Phuket, right? It's literally called
Phuket.
Yeah. And I'm down.
Fitness Street.
There's like Tiger Muay Thai and stuff down there. I would be down for that because apparently in Thailand it's so cheap that you really don't need much money. You could almost make a living off of fighting. But anyway, I'll have to get back into MMA.
It's funny at least.
Yeah, but I digress. I think we covered a lot of good stuff. We were like over 2 hours into this.
2 hours in.
We got a lot of good stuff. This is a great conversation. I hope to have you back on because I think not to deride anybody at all, but I think a lot of times with the online right, people just want to talk about the cool shit. They want to talk about all the exciting aesthetics of everything, and then you start to repeat the same thing over and over again, like 10 different ways, and it's like, what are we even talking about right now? Whereas I think there's not as many people on the right like you who've read all these different people like Bataille or Baudrillard or whatever, and I think it's important to really reckon with a lot of this stuff because, like, let's be real here, there is a lot of good philosophy on the left that is easily appropriated for the right, for the purposes of the right. And even I would say if you don't read these people, you can't really engage in philosophy on the right. So anyway, not to glaze or anything, but thank you for joining. It was and I like the book, everyone. Get a copy of dude, my background's fucking up here. Can't even see it. It's so schizo you can't even see the cover.
That's awesome.
But it's there. It's there.
Oh my god.
Schizoposting.
Yeah, it's also free on as a PDF on my profile. So it's usually like I talk to people. Yeah, they're like, I don't care if you buy it in print. If you read it online and you really like it, buy it in print. Buy 10 copies in print. Leave them places. But it is also free. I wanted to do that because a lot of times people write books and it's like just buy my book, and I buy all my friends' books, but at the same time, look, I've done it. I ran a publishing company, but this one I wanted to just put out. I think it should exist as like a weird internet artifact as well. I like that aspect of it. But yeah, hopefully people read it and enjoy it. So far the response has been good. Obviously I appreciate your comments and you having me on, but as always, the orientation is to do things. I like word selling as much as anybody else, and I just wrote a book. But it should be in service of doing things. That's if there's one message, it's that.
Sounds good. I agree. And you set the schizo post into reality. Don't just schizo post, schizo act, schizo be in the world.
Yes,
and
hyperstition.
And we will win. We will win in the end. But yeah, well, thank you so much for coming on. Last question I have is: Are you still going to be putting out any dissident review things, or is that project sort of to the side for now?
It's at the very least paused for the moment. Sort of a personal life thing, but at the very least paused. I also was getting huge issues on Amazon with copyright for books that were blatantly out of copyright. Like I did that 10-book Conquistador collection, and I think they let me publish 2. And they were giving me the runaround for months on other ones. So just sort of on pause for the moment. So, there are some other things in relation to that coming. We'll see. I can't say much now, but there are other things.
Sounds good. Well, we'll keep that a secret for now. But one day I'm going to start a big media company, and I'm just going to give all my friends, FRENS, money to write shit and stuff.
Yeah.
That's the goal. That's the goal. We're gonna be what's his name? Robert Murdoch or whatever, the Fox News founder.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, we're gonna be Murdoch Maxing, creating a not gay Daily Wire. But anyway, without further ado, thanks again, Alaric, for joining. Thank you, Legionaries, for watching. If you made it this far, you will get a Roman eagle delivered to you by drone, airdropped onto your doorstep. But without further ado, this is the Warrior Philosopher, building the foundations of the Warrior Philosophy. Ave Nova Roma.